The most shocking thing about Victorian drug use isn't what they took, it's who was taking it. While you picture stern, moral citizens sipping tea, they were actually consuming substances that would land you in prison today. But there's one disturbing detail that changes everything about how we see this era. Walking into a Victorian chemist shop was like entering a candy store for adults, except the candy could knock you unconscious or give you hallucinations. The year was 1850, and British pharmacies lined their shelves with bottles of opium, laudanum, and cocaine, right next to the tooth powder and soap. No prescriptions needed, no questions asked. The friendly neighborhood chemist would measure out your opium with the same casual attitude as weighing tea leaves. "How much would you like today, Mrs. Henderson?" became a perfectly normal question when discussing potentially lethal narcotics. These weren't hidden behind locked cabinets or marked with skull and crossbone warnings. They sat openly on wooden shelves, their contents described in flowing Victorian script that made morphine sound as harmless as peppermint drops. But here's where it gets really wild. Chemist shops weren't the only places selling these powerful drugs. Market halls buzzed with traveling sellers hawking their opium-laced wares to anyone with a few coins. Picture the local farmer's market. Except alongside fresh vegetables and homemade bread, you'd find vendors cheerfully advertising finest quality opium for all your medicinal needs. These wandering drug dealers moved from town to town, their horse-drawn carts loaded with enough narcotics to supply a modern hospital. The system operated on pure trust and ignorance. Before 1868, nobody checked your age when buying opium. A 10-year-old could stroll into any pharmacy and purchase enough laudanum to drug an entire household. The chemist might chat about the weather while measuring out a potentially fatal dose, then wrap it in brown paper with a smile. "Give my regards to your mother, young man." What makes this even more incredible is how normalized it all became. Victorian families treated opium purchases like grocery shopping. Mothers sent their children to fetch laudanum the same way they'd send them for milk or flour. The kids would skip down cobblestone streets, coins jingling in their pockets, completely unaware they were about to buy substances that would land them in prison today. Then there's the traveling medicine shows that turned drug dealing into entertainment. These colorful characters set up in village squares, complete with banjo music and dancing assistants. They'd deliver passionate speeches about their miracle cures while bottles of cocaine-laced tonics changed hands faster than hotcakes. The audience clapped and cheered as they bought products that could stop their hearts. The really shocking part, many of these dangerous medicines were specifically marketed to solve everyday problems. Feeling tired after a long day? Try our cocaine drops. Baby won't stop crying. A spoonful of opium syrup will fix that right up. Nervous about your upcoming wedding? Laudanum makes everything better. Victorian advertising made these drugs sound like solutions to life's minor inconveniences rather than potentially deadly chemicals. Even more bizarre was how casually people discussed their drug habits. Victorian dinner parties featured conversations about favorite opium brands the way modern people might debate coffee preferences. "Oh, I simply must recommend Johnson's laudanum. It has such a smooth finish," became acceptable social chatter among respectable ladies and gentlemen. The lack of regulation created a free-for-all marketplace where anyone could become a drug dealer overnight. Bored housewives started mixing their own opium concoctions in kitchen pots, then selling them to neighbors. Retired soldiers opened small shops specializing in cocaine remedies. Even clergy members weren't above recommending their favorite morphine suppliers to parishioners suffering from headaches. Quality control was non-existent, which meant buyers never knew exactly what they were getting. One bottle of soothing syrup might contain a mild dose of opium, while another from the same manufacturer could pack enough punch to put someone in a coma for days. It was pharmaceutical Russian roulette, and everyone played. The strangest part of this whole system was how it coexisted with Victorian society's obsession with moral behavior. The same culture that clutched pearls over women showing their ankles had no problem with children buying potentially lethal drugs at the corner store. Proper ladies who would never dream of drinking alcohol in public thought nothing of sipping laudanum at afternoon tea. What's truly mind-boggling is how long this lasted. For decades, British society functioned while huge portions of the population regularly consumed powerful narcotics. Workers showed up to factories high on opium. Politicians made decisions while under the influence of cocaine, and teachers managed classrooms full of children whose parents had dosed them with morphine for breakfast. The sheer scale of this unregulated drug market would make modern law enforcement officers break out in cold sweats. But for Victorians, it was just Tuesday. And the weird part is, this wasn't happening in some lawless frontier town. This was supposedly civilized Victorian Britain, where proper etiquette mattered more than anything. Well, almost anything. Because while they worried about using the wrong fork at dinner, they were perfectly comfortable turning their entire society into willing drug addicts through their daily medicine routines. Walking down any Victorian street meant passing shops where opium sat right next to the bread and butter. The stuff wasn't hidden away or whispered about in dark corners. People bought it like they'd grab milk for tea. Rich families stocked their medicine cabinets with the same dangerous concoctions that working-class mothers gave their crying babies. Class differences meant nothing when it came to getting high. Factory workers discovered something magical about opium during those brutal 12-hour shifts. A quick dose dulled the ache in their backs and made the repetitive motions bearable. Why suffer through another day of mind-numbing labor when relief cost just a few pennies? The bosses didn't complain either. Drugged workers caused fewer problems and rarely demanded better conditions. Win-win, right? Artists and writers took things to another level entirely. They didn't just use opium to survive, they used it to create. Famous poets would gather in London parlours, passing around laudanum like fine wine. They claimed the drug opened their minds to brilliant ideas and beautiful visions. Some of the era's most celebrated literature came from authors who were completely stoned out of their minds. Then there were the housewives, armed with medicine bottles that would terrify modern doctors. Victorian women faced constant pressure to keep perfect homes while managing large families. Their solution: daily doses of opium-laced tonics that promised to calm nerves and boost energy. These mothers' helpers became as essential as cleaning supplies. Nobody questioned why Mrs. Henderson next door seemed so cheerful while scrubbing floors all day. The Industrial Revolution created the perfect storm for widespread drug use. Cities exploded with newcomers seeking factory jobs, cramming into filthy neighborhoods where disease spread like wildfire. Traditional family support systems crumbled under the pressure of urban life. People needed something to cope with the chaos, and drugs provided an easy escape from harsh reality. Working families especially embraced opium because it solved multiple problems at once. Hungry children stopped complaining about empty stomachs after a spoonful of drugged syrup. Exhausted parents could push through another day of back-breaking work. The medicine chest became the family's best friend, offering chemical solutions to every hardship. What's particularly striking is how normal this all seemed to everyone involved. Victorian advertising made drug use seem not just acceptable but fashionable. Newspaper ads promised that opium would cure everything from headaches to heartbreak. Wealthy socialites endorsed products containing cocaine, claiming the drug kept them looking young and energetic. If rich people were using these medicines, working folks figured they must be safe and effective. Medical professionals actually encouraged heavy drug use during this period. Doctors prescribed opium for conditions we'd treat with rest today: mild fevers, upset stomachs, even sadness. They genuinely believed these substances were miracle cures with no serious side effects. Patients trusted their physicians completely, taking whatever doses were recommended without question. The weird part is how drug habits spread through entire communities like trends. Once one family in a neighborhood started using a particular opium mixture, everyone else wanted to try it too. People shared recipes for homemade drug concoctions the same way they'd swap cooking tips. Community medicine chests became informal libraries of dangerous knowledge. Children grew up thinking drug use was completely normal because they watched adults dose themselves daily. Kids as young as 5 knew exactly which bottles contained the good medicine that made pain disappear. They learned to recognize the sweet smell of laudanum and the bitter taste of cocaine lozenges. This childhood exposure created generations who never questioned the safety of regular drug consumption. Some Victorian families spent more money on medicine than food. The constant need for opium and other substances drained household budgets, but people couldn't stop buying the stuff once they started. They'd sacrifice new clothes or better housing to ensure their medicine supply never ran out. Addiction disguised itself as medical necessity, making it impossible to recognize the real problem. Professional drug sellers understood exactly what they were doing. They marketed products specifically to different social classes, creating fancy versions for wealthy customers and cheaper alternatives for working families. The core ingredients remained the same, but packaging and pricing made each group feel special about their particular drug habits. What makes Victorian drug culture so fascinating is how it touched every aspect of daily life. People dosed themselves before work, during meals, and right before bed. They gave drugs to their children, their elderly relatives, even their pets. The boundary between medicine and recreation completely disappeared, creating a society where being sober was actually unusual, But this widespread acceptance was about to face some serious challenges. The very popularity that made drug use seem harmless was also creating problems that couldn't be ignored much longer. Sometimes the most dangerous storms arrive on the clearest days, and Victorian Britain's drug paradise was heading for some very dark clouds. Victorian families weren't content to simply buy their medicines from the local chemist. They rolled up their sleeves and became amateur pharmacists in their own kitchens. Home remedies weren't just popular, they were practically a national obsession. Every household had its secret recipes, passed down through generations like precious family heirlooms. The typical Victorian pantry looked more like a drug laboratory than a food storage area. Opium sat next to the flour, laudanum bottles lined up beside the tea canisters. Mothers measured out morphine with the same casual precision they used for baking powder. These weren't desperate measures either. This was considered proper housekeeping. Patent medicines dominated the homemade remedy scene, but here's where things get interesting. These weren't patented in the modern sense. The term patent medicine was marketing genius at its finest. Companies could slap that label on any concoction without revealing the actual ingredients or getting government approval. Brilliant for business, terrifying for consumers. Godfrey's cordial became the undisputed champion of Victorian home medicine cabinets. This syrup contained enough opium to knock out a horse, yet mothers spooned it into babies like it was honey. The marketing described it as soothing and gentle. Well, anything that renders you unconscious could technically be called soothing. The cordial promised to cure everything from teething pain to adult insomnia. One bottle, endless possibilities, or endless dangers. Dover's powder held second place in popularity contests. This white powder mixed opium with ipecac, creating a combination that was supposed to treat fevers and coughs. Families stored jars of this stuff like we store aspirin today. The irony, Dover's powder often caused more problems than it solved. But Victorian logic suggested if a little helped, more must be better. Then there were the homemade concoctions that make modern chemists break into cold sweats. Victorian housewives mixed opium with alcohol, added some herbs for good measure, and called it medicine. Recipe books from the era read like chemistry experiments gone wrong. Take 2 ounces of laudanum, mix with brandy, add honey for taste. These weren't medical professionals writing prescriptions. These were ordinary people playing with dangerous substances. The creativity was astounding, if reckless. Some families made opium tea for headaches. Others created laudanum drops for toothaches. Enterprising mothers developed their own versions of soothing syrups by mixing store-bought opium with whatever they had handy. Sugar, alcohol, herbs, anything that might mask the bitter taste and make the medicine more palatable. But why did families trust these dangerous mixtures so completely? The answer reveals something fascinating about Victorian psychology. They lived in an age of rapid change and uncertainty. New diseases appeared as people crowded into industrial cities. Traditional remedies felt reliable and controllable. Making medicine at home gave families a sense of power over their health destiny. The cottage industry of home remedies exploded during this period. Neighbors shared recipes like they shared gossip. Mrs. Henderson's cough syrup works wonders. Just mix laudanum with honey and a splash of gin. These informal networks spread dangerous formulas faster than any advertising campaign could manage. Quality control was non-existent. One family's effective remedy might contain 3 times the opium of another's gentle version. Dosages varied wildly based on whoever was mixing that particular batch. Some remedies packed enough narcotic punch to be lethal, while others contained barely enough to be effective. Russian roulette, Victorian style. The most disturbing part? Many of these homemade medicines were specifically designed for children. Parents genuinely believed they were providing the best possible care. Mothers stayed up all night preparing special mixtures for sick babies, carefully measuring out doses that would horrify modern parents. Love and ignorance created a deadly combination. These home remedy habits weren't limited to desperate situations either. Families used opium-based medicines for minor complaints that wouldn't warrant a doctor's visit today. Stomach upset, opium mixture. Trouble sleeping, laudanum drops. Feeling anxious, another dose of Godfrey's cordial. The casual nature of it all seems almost impossible to believe now. The strangest aspect was how normal it all seemed to Victorian society. Cookbooks included remedy recipes alongside instructions for making bread. Women's magazines featured articles about preparing medicines next to fashion advice. Home medicine preparation was considered an essential domestic skill, like sewing or managing servants. What makes this home remedy boom even more remarkable is how it connected to the broader drug availability we've already explored. Easy access to raw materials made kitchen chemistry possible, while the lack of medical knowledge made it seem sensible. But as families became more comfortable mixing their own medicines, something even more troubling was developing. The line between medicine and addiction was about to disappear entirely, especially when it came to the smallest and most vulnerable members of Victorian households. Victorian mothers had a secret weapon for crying babies. Godfrey's cordial. Sounds harmless enough, right? Well, this miracle cure contained enough opium to knock out a grown man. But here's the shocking part. Doctors recommended it specifically for infants. The bottle sat on every nursery shelf like a trusted friend. Teething troubles. A few drops of Godfrey's. Colic keeping everyone awake. More cordial. Fussy baby during church. You know what came next? Victorian mothers treated opium like we treat children's Tylenol today, except their version could kill. Mrs. Sarah Mitchell from Birmingham wrote in her diary about giving her 6-month-old son 3 spoonfuls of the blessed cordial for his crying fits. 3 spoonfuls. That's roughly equivalent to giving a baby a shot of morphine. Her son slept for 18 hours straight. She thought it was a miracle. The baby had overdosed. Then there's the marketing genius behind these products. Advertisements promised instant relief for restless children, and peaceful nights for tired mothers. One popular brand, Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, claimed to be perfectly harmless while containing 65 milligrams of morphine per ounce. That's enough to seriously harm an adult, let alone a baby weighing 10 pounds. The dosages were absolutely insane by today's standards. Dr. Thomas Bull's popular childcare manual recommended giving infants between 2 and 20 drops of laudanum for various ailments. 20 drops could easily kill a small child, but Victorian parents trusted these instructions completely. Medical professionals wrote them. After all, what makes this even more disturbing is how casual the whole process was. Mothers would chat about their favorite brands like they were discussing recipes. Oh, I prefer Godfrey's over Dover's powder. It works much faster. They had no idea they were comparing different ways to drug their children into unconsciousness. The results were predictably tragic. Infant mortality rates in areas with heavy opium use were astronomical. Coroner's reports from the 1840s and 1850s show dozens of cases where babies died from over-laudanum, basically opium poisoning. But here's the really messed up part. Many deaths were never connected to the medicine at all. Victorian doctors called it sudden infant death, or blamed it on weak constitution. They couldn't imagine that the trusted family medicine was actually killing children. Some babies who survived developed what we'd now recognize as severe addiction. Infants going through withdrawal, crying inconsolably until their next dose. Mothers interpreted this as proof the medicine was needed. The strangest part was how different social classes approached infant drugging. Wealthy families employed wet nurses who often had their own opium habits, passing addiction through breast milk. Working-class mothers, meanwhile, used the drugs as childcare. Drop some cordial in the baby's mouth before heading to the factory for a 12-hour shift. The child would sleep until evening. Rural areas were even worse. Country chemists sold homemade concoctions that were stronger and cheaper than city brands. Farming families would dose entire households, babies, toddlers, even pregnant mothers, with the same opium mixture. One bottle handled everyone's problems, from teething to backaches. But the most heartbreaking cases involved the quiet babies. These were infants so regularly dosed with opiates that they stopped crying altogether. Victorian mothers bragged about having such good babies. Other mothers sought their advice, wanting to know their secret. The secret was systematic drugging. Medical records from Manchester General Hospital show babies arriving with symptoms we now know indicate severe opiate addiction: trembling, difficulty breathing, inability to feed properly. Victorian doctors diagnosed these symptoms as natural weakness and often prescribed more opium. Some progressive doctors started noticing patterns by the 1860s. Dr. William Farr published statistics showing that areas with the highest opium sales also had the highest infant death rates, but his warnings were largely ignored. The opium baby bottle was too convenient, too trusted, too profitable to abandon easily. The advertising kept getting more aggressive too. Companies hired medical consultants to endorse their products. Testimonials from satisfied mothers filled newspaper pages. One advertisement claimed that babies given their cordial would sleep like angels and wake refreshed. Many of those babies never woke up at all. Even when children survived their opium infancy, many suffered lasting effects: slow development, learning difficulties, and chronic health problems plagued these kids throughout their lives. Victorian society created an entire generation of children whose brains were damaged before they could even walk. The scariest realization is how normalized this all became. Drugging babies wasn't seen as abuse or neglect, it was considered responsible parenting. The mother who didn't have opium cordial in her medicine cabinet was viewed as unprepared, maybe even neglectful. What's truly mind-blowing is that some of these dangerous baby medicines remained legal and popular well into the 1890s. While scientists were discovering electricity and building railways, mothers were still poisoning their infants with medieval remedies dressed up in fancy Victorian packaging. But the opium baby bottle wasn't the only shocking aspect of Victorian drug culture. Adult addiction was spreading through an entirely different, yet equally dangerous path. Laudanum wasn't just another medicine sitting on Victorian shelves. This liquid version of opium became the go-to remedy for practically everything that ailed the human body. Mix opium with alcohol, add a few herbs for flavor, and you had yourself a miracle cure that tasted better than straight opium and worked faster than solid pills. The brownish liquid came in small glass bottles with fancy labels. Chemists sold it by the ounce or in convenient dropper bottles that fit perfectly in a coat pocket or lady's purse. Unlike the bitter taste of raw opium, laudanum had a slightly sweet medicinal flavor that made it easier to swallow. Victorian families kept bottles of it right next to their tea and sugar. What made laudanum so popular? Speed and convenience. A few drops under the tongue provided instant relief from headaches, stomach cramps or sleepless nights. Women used it for monthly pains. Men took it after long days of physical labor. Students relied on it during stressful exam periods. The liquid format meant you could measure out exactly what you needed, or so people thought. But here's where things get interesting. Nobody really knew how to measure proper doses. One person might take 5 drops for a headache while their neighbor took 20 drops for the same problem. Bottles rarely came with instructions beyond take as needed. Victorian families basically guessed their way through dosing, and some guesses turned out very wrong. Charles Dickens kept laudanum in his writing desk. The famous author dealt with kidney stones and used the liquid opium to manage his pain during long writing sessions. Samuel Taylor Coleridge, the poet who wrote about ancient mariners, became so dependent on laudanum that he consumed massive amounts daily. His drug use inspired some of his most famous dreamlike poetry, but it also nearly destroyed his health and relationships. Then there's the curious case of Victorian women and their nerve medicine. Doctors regularly prescribed laudanum for what they called female hysteria, nervousness and melancholy. Ladies would carry small silver bottles filled with laudanum drops, taking sips throughout the day like we might drink coffee. Social gatherings sometimes featured women discreetly sharing their laudanum supplies when someone complained of feeling faint or anxious. The medical profession absolutely loved prescribing laudanum because it worked for almost everything. Toothache? Laudanum. Diarrhea? Laudanum. Cough that won't quit? More laudanum. Broken bone pain? You guessed it. Doctors felt confident recommending something that provided such reliable relief, even if they didn't fully understand why it worked so well. Victorian pharmacists developed dozens of laudanum variations. Some added camphor for extra pain relief. Others mixed in peppermint to improve the taste. Specialty versions targeted specific problems like Dover's powder, which combined laudanum with ipecac for treating colds and fevers. Each chemist had their own secret recipe, creating a marketplace full of slightly different opium preparations. The convenience factor cannot be overstated. Unlike smoking opium, which required pipes and preparation time, laudanum worked instantly. A businessman could take laudanum drops during a meeting without anyone noticing. A mother could slip some into her tea while managing household duties. The discreet nature of liquid opium made it acceptable in polite society. Working-class families particularly relied on laudanum because it was cheaper than visiting doctors. Why pay for medical consultations when a bottle of laudanum solved most problems? Factory workers took it before shifts to dull the pain of repetitive labor. Seamstresses used it to stay alert during long hours of detailed work. Agricultural workers relied on it during harvest seasons when physical demands peaked. Some Victorian users discovered that laudanum enhanced certain experiences. Artists claimed it boosted creativity. Writers said it helped them work through the night. Musicians reported that small doses improved their performance anxiety. This recreational use happened alongside medical use, creating a culture where the line between medicine and pleasure drug became quite blurry. The addiction potential of laudanum caught many Victorians completely off guard. People who started taking it for legitimate medical reasons found themselves unable to stop. They needed larger doses to achieve the same relief. When they tried to quit, they experienced withdrawal symptoms that felt worse than their original problems. Many didn't realize they had developed physical dependence until they tried to go without their daily laudanum dose. Victorian literature is filled with references to laudanum because so many writers used it personally. They wrote about the vivid dreams it produced, the way it changed their perception of time, and the creative insights that seemed to flow more freely under its influence. These literary accounts helped normalize laudanum use among educated classes who saw drug use as sophisticated and artistic. What's particularly striking is how openly Victorians discussed laudanum use. Unlike today's secretive approach to pain medication, Victorian society treated laudanum as completely normal. People shared dosing tips at dinner parties and recommended their favorite brands to friends experiencing similar health issues. But this widespread acceptance was about to face some serious challenges. As more families dealt with laudanum dependency problems, questions began emerging about whether this miracle cure might actually be causing more harm than good. The arrival of an even more powerful drug would soon shake up Victorian medicine cabinets in ways nobody expected. The 1860s brought something entirely new to Britain's already crowded drug marketplace. Cocaine had just been extracted from coca leaves in a German laboratory, and by the 1880s British chemists were selling it like candy. This wasn't some back-alley substance either. Respectable pharmacists displayed cocaine right next to their opium bottles, often recommending it as the superior choice. What made cocaine so appealing? Well, unlike opium that made people drowsy and sluggish, cocaine energized them. Victorian doctors noticed this immediately. They started prescribing cocaine lozenges for sore throats and persistent coughs. The logic seemed sound enough, many as if your throat hurt, suck on a cocaine lozenge and you'd feel better instantly. Makes sense, right? But the real selling point came from cocaine's reputation as a miracle cure for indigestion. Victorian Britain had terrible food safety standards, so stomach problems plagued everyone from factory workers to wealthy merchants. Cocaine promised quick relief from bloating, gas, and stomach pain. Cocaine's advertised it as nature's perfect digestive aid. They weren't technically lying. Cocaine did make people feel amazing after eating. The problem was everything else that came with it. Then there were the doctors prescribing cocaine for what they called melancholia and nervous exhaustion. Today we'd recognize these as depression and anxiety, but Victorian physicians had limited understanding of mental health. They saw patients complaining of sadness, fatigue, or worry, and cocaine seemed like the perfect solution. Why wouldn't you give someone an energizing drug if they felt tired and sad? The weird part is how cocaine became medicine's golden boy so quickly. Medical journals published glowing reports about its benefits. Respected physicians wrote papers praising cocaine's versatility. Some doctors even experimented on themselves, noting how cocaine improved their mood and stamina. These weren't quack remedies sold by traveling salesmen. This was mainstream Victorian medicine embracing a powerful stimulant. Cocaine lozenges became especially popular among public speakers, teachers, and clergymen. Anyone who needed to project their voice for hours could pop a cocaine lozenge and feel their throat clear up instantly. The drug numbed pain while providing energy, making it seem perfect for professions requiring long periods of speaking. Church services got a lot more animated when the vicar had been sucking cocaine lozenges all morning. Let's not forget cocaine's revolutionary role in surgery. Before cocaine, operations were brutal affairs involving alcohol, opium, or simply holding the patient down. When doctors discovered cocaine's numbing properties, surgery transformed overnight. They could inject cocaine directly into the area being operated on, eliminating pain without knocking the patient unconscious. This breakthrough saved countless lives and made previously impossible procedures routine. Victorian advertisements for cocaine products read like modern energy drink marketing. Feeling tired after a long day's work, one ad asked, "Try Dr. Morrison's cocaine tablets for instant relief." Another promised that cocaine lozenges would restore vitality to the overworked businessman and bring clarity to the troubled mind. These weren't subtle medical recommendations, they were aggressive sales pitches targeting anyone feeling stressed or exhausted. The dosages being sold would horrify modern doctors. Cocaine lozenges contained amounts that would be considered dangerous today, but Victorian chemists had no concept of addiction or long-term health effects. They sold cocaine like aspirin, recommending multiple doses throughout the day for best results. Some products combined cocaine with other stimulants, creating combinations that would send users' hearts racing. What really shows how normalized cocaine had become was its presence in household medicine cabinets. Families kept cocaine lozenges next to their laudanum bottles and patent medicines. Children could access these products as easily as they could reach the sugar bowl. Parents gave cocaine lozenges to teenagers for toothaches or sore throats without a second thought. Professional cocaine users developed their own culture around the drug. Artists claimed it enhanced creativity. Lawyers said it sharpened their thinking during long trials. Even some policemen used cocaine to stay alert during night shifts. The drug's stimulating effects made it perfect for anyone needing to maintain focus and energy for extended periods. But cocaine wasn't cheap like opium. Higher prices meant it became associated with successful professionals rather than struggling working families. This created a strange social hierarchy, where opium was seen as the poor person's drug while cocaine represented sophistication and modern medicine. Wealthy Victorians bragged about their cocaine prescriptions the way people today might mention expensive vitamins. The medical establishment's enthusiasm for cocaine seemed unstoppable throughout the 1880s. Doctors recommended it for everything from hay fever to seasickness. Dentists used it for tooth extractions. Even veterinarians began experimenting with cocaine for animal surgeries. The drug appeared to be medicine's ultimate breakthrough, yet even as cocaine's popularity soared, some disturbing patterns were emerging. Patients who used cocaine regularly began demanding larger doses. Others became agitated and paranoid when they couldn't get their usual supply. These warning signs would eventually reshape how Britain viewed its newest miracle cure, but that reckoning still lay ahead. The Victorian mother faced a crying baby at 3 a.m. What did she reach for? Not a pacifier or gentle lullaby. She grabbed a bottle of mother's friend syrup from the kitchen shelf. One spoonful, maybe two, and her restless infant would drift into peaceful silence. The secret ingredient making this miracle possible: pure opium. These soothing syrups weren't hidden remedies whispered about in back alleys. They sat proudly on pharmacy shelves with cheerful labels promising relief from colic, diarrhea, and sleepless nights. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup became a household name across Britain. Mothers trusted it completely. Why wouldn't they? The friendly advertisements showed happy babies and grateful parents getting their much-needed rest. But here's the twisted part about these innocent-looking bottles. Each dose contained enough opium to knock out a grown man for hours. Victorian mothers had no idea they were essentially drugging their children into unconsciousness. The manufacturers certainly weren't advertising that detail on their colorful packaging. Mother's Friend products came in dozens of varieties, each claiming special powers. Some promised to cure teething pain instantly. Others guaranteed quiet nights for the whole family. The marketing was brilliant and absolutely ruthless. Companies targeted exhausted mothers with promises that seemed too good to be true. Well, they were too good to be true. But nobody realized it yet. Let's not forget how these syrups actually worked their supposed magic. The opium didn't cure anything. It simply sedated babies so deeply they couldn't cry, move, or show any signs of discomfort. Parents mistook this drug-induced stupor for peaceful healing sleep. Meanwhile, their children's tiny bodies were processing dangerous amounts of narcotics daily. The dosing instructions on these bottles would horrify modern parents. Give freely as needed appeared on many labels. Some suggested doses every few hours throughout the day. Others recommended increasing the amount if the first dose didn't work quickly enough. No warnings about overdose risks. No mention of addiction potential. Just cheerful promises of family harmony. Then there's the really dark truth about what happened to children who received these syrups regularly. Many developed serious health problems that parents couldn't explain. Babies who once ate eagerly would refuse food for days. Active toddlers became listless and pale. Some children stopped growing at normal rates. Their parents, trying to help, often increased the syrup doses, thinking more medicine would cure these mysterious symptoms. Victorian doctors began noticing disturbing patterns in their young patients, but connecting the dots took years. Children from families who used these syrups frequently showed similar symptoms: slow reflexes, delayed speech development, unexplained breathing problems. Some physicians started asking parents about their medicine cabinet contents, and the answers were revealing. The addiction crisis among Victorian children was massive but largely invisible. Babies who received daily doses of opium-laced syrups developed physical dependence within weeks. When parents tried to stop giving the medicine, their children became inconsolable, crying fits, trembling, refusing to eat. Desperate parents assumed their child was sick again and returned to the syrups immediately. What makes this situation even more heartbreaking is how completely parents trusted these products. Victorian mothers weren't reckless or uncaring. They genuinely believed they were giving their children the best available medicine. The advertising was so convincing, and the immediate results seemed so positive. A crying baby would indeed become quiet and sleepy. Mission accomplished, right? But the human cost was staggering. Medical records from the era show thousands of infant deaths linked to opium overdoses from these syrups. Many more children survived but suffered long-term developmental problems. Some became lifelong addicts before they could even walk properly. The tragedy was that none of this was necessary. Most of the problems these syrups claimed to treat would have resolved naturally with time and basic care. The manufacturers knew exactly what they were selling, even if parents didn't. Internal company documents from later investigations revealed that producers understood the addictive nature of their products. They also knew that creating dependent customers meant guaranteed repeat sales. Cynical business strategy disguised as family medicine. Some forward-thinking doctors began speaking out against these products in medical journals during the 1870s and 1880s. They published case studies showing the connection between syrup use and child health problems. But changing public opinion took time. Many families had used these products for generations. Breaking that tradition required overwhelming evidence of harm. The social pressure to use these syrups was intense in Victorian communities. Mothers who didn't give their children the popular remedies faced criticism from neighbors and relatives. Why is your baby still crying when Mrs. Johnson's children sleep so peacefully? The implied judgment was clear. Good mothers used effective medicine. This hidden crisis in Victorian nurseries reveals something disturbing about how easily dangerous practices can become normal when wrapped in appealing marketing. But the story gets even stranger when we look at how these same drug-laced remedies spread beyond baby bottles into every corner of British society. The countryside wasn't immune to Victorian Britain's drug craze. Far from it. While city folk had their fancy chemist shops, rural areas had something even more fascinating. Traveling hawkers who brought narcotics right to farmhouse doors. These wandering salesmen carried everything from raw opium to cocaine lozenges in their horse-drawn carts, turning village visits into pharmaceutical adventures. Picture a typical market day in rural Yorkshire around 1860. Farmers gathered not just for livestock and grain, but to stock up on medicinal supplies from traveling merchants. These hawkers knew their audience well. They'd roll into town with colourful bottles and dramatic sales pitches, promising cures for everything from sheep parasites to human headaches. The same opium mixture that calmed crying babies in London also helped Yorkshire farmers sleep through winter storms. But here's where things get really interesting. Rural folks didn't just buy drugs for themselves, they used them on their animals too. Farmers discovered that a pinch of opium in animal feed could calm agitated livestock during long journeys to market. Sick cattle got opium-laced treatments just like sick children. One farmer's diary from 1865 mentions giving laudanum to a colicky mare, using the same bottle he used for his own stomach troubles. The line between veterinary and human medicine barely existed. Village general stores became unofficial pharmacies, their shelves lined with patent medicines that would shock modern regulators. Store owners had no medical training, but they dispensed advice along with drugs like seasoned doctors. A shopkeeper in rural Devon kept detailed records showing he sold more opium-based remedies than flour during harsh winter months. Makes sense when you realize these medicines promised relief from everything that made country life miserable. Joint pain from farm labor, sleepless nights in drafty cottages, and the constant worry of sick animals. The most surprising part, rural drug use often exceeded city consumption rates. Country folk faced isolation, harsh weather, and physical demands that made narcotic relief incredibly appealing. When your nearest doctor lived 20 miles away and winter roads were impassable, that bottle of laudanum became your entire medical system. Farming families passed down drug recipes like cooking techniques, creating homemade mixtures that combined opium with local herbs and honey. Then there were the itinerant medicine shows that transformed drug sales into entertainment. These traveling performers combined circus acts with pharmaceutical pitches, drawing crowds from miles around. A typical show featured a charismatic doctor who'd demonstrate his miracle cures using audience volunteers. After the show, people lined up to buy bottles of his secret formula, usually opium or cocaine mixed with alcohol and sugar. These shows were so popular that villages scheduled festivals around their visits. Rural regulations were practically non-existent before 1868. City chemists at least kept some records, but country sellers operated in complete freedom. A traveling hawker could sell pure opium to a 10-year-old child without anyone batting an eye. No licenses, no inspections, no questions asked. The countryside became a free market paradise for drug dealers, where competition drove prices so low that even the poorest agricultural workers could afford regular narcotic use. Geographic isolation created unique drug cultures in different regions. Scottish Highland communities developed their own opium-based warming drinks to combat brutal winters. Welsh mining villages used cocaine preparations to help workers stay alert during dangerous underground shifts. Each area adapted narcotics to local needs, creating regional variations that city dwellers never experienced. Agricultural workers found creative ways to incorporate drugs into their daily routines. Harvest teams shared opium-laced drinks that helped them work longer hours during crucial farming periods. Shepherds carried laudanum on long hill walks, using it for both pain relief and sleep aid. Dairy maids discovered that certain patent medicines helped them wake up for pre-dawn milking duties. Drug use became woven into the rhythm of rural work life. The weird part is how openly rural communities embraced these substances. Village newspapers ran advertisements for traveling medicine sellers alongside notices about church services and crop prices. Local gossip included updates on which hawker had the strongest remedies or the best prices. Drug use carried no shame in countryside communities. It was just practical problem solving. But this rural drug paradise couldn't last forever. As communication improved and newspapers spread information about drug dangers, country attitudes began shifting. Some village leaders started questioning whether their traditional remedies were really as harmless as everyone believed. While farmers were dosing themselves and their livestock with whatever traveling salesman brought to their doors, another group was quietly developing its own relationship with Victorian narcotics. Women across all social classes were discovering how patent medicines could solve problems that proper society preferred to ignore completely. Victorian women faced unique pressures that made patent medicines seem like lifesavers. Their daily routines involved managing households, raising children, and dealing with what doctors called female complaints, a catch-all term for everything from mood swings to menstrual pain. The remedy? A daily dose of opium-laced tonics that promised relief from life's burdens. These women weren't seeking thrills or escaping reality for fun. They genuinely believed they were taking medicine. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup became a household name, marketed directly to mothers struggling with cranky babies and their own exhaustion. The advertisements spoke their language, for restless nights and peaceful days. What the ads didn't mention was the morphine content that made those peaceful days possible. Well, the marketing aimed at women was brilliant in its manipulation. Companies understood that Victorian ladies were expected to maintain perfect composure while managing impossible demands. Patent medicine makers capitalized on this pressure, creating products with names like Mother's Helper and Lady's Friend. These weren't just medicines, they were solutions to the problem of being a woman in Victorian society. The dosages were staggering by modern standards. A typical bottle of laudanum contained enough opium to knock out a grown man, yet women were taking teaspoons multiple times daily. Some kept small bottles hidden in their sewing baskets or kitchen cupboards, taking quick sips whenever stress mounted. The ritual became as normal as brewing tea. Pregnancy brought its own set of drug-related practices that would horrify modern doctors. Victorian physicians regularly prescribed opium mixtures to pregnant women for morning sickness, back pain, and general discomfort. During labor, laudanum was considered essential for managing pain. Midwives carried bottles like modern paramedics carry emergency supplies. The idea that these substances might harm developing babies simply wasn't understood yet. But here's where things get darker. Many women developed what they called nervous dependency on their medicines. They'd start with a teaspoon for headaches, then need more for the same effect. Soon they were drinking entire bottles weekly. Their families often didn't notice because the symptoms, drowsiness, mood swings, digestive problems, were dismissed as typical female frailty. The class divide affected women's drug use differently than men's. Wealthy ladies could afford higher quality preparations from respected chemists, while working-class women bought cheaper versions from market stalls. The rich got consistent dosages and purer ingredients. The poor got whatever the traveling salesman was hawking that week, often with dangerous additives or wildly varying potency. Then there were the social gatherings where women shared their favorite remedies. Tea parties became informal pharmaceutical exchanges. "Oh, you must try Dr. Hammond's nerve tonic for your melancholy," one woman might tell another. These recommendations spread through communities faster than gossip, creating networks of unwitting addicts who thought they were sharing health tips. Victorian doctors played a complicated role in women's drug use. Many genuinely believed that females were naturally more delicate and required regular medication to function. They prescribed opiates for conditions that would barely warrant aspirin today. Feeling tired, laudanum. Anxious about social events, opium drops. Can't sleep, a bedtime dose of morphine syrup. The weird part is how these drugs affected women's daily capabilities. While opium made them drowsy and dependent, it also numbed the physical and emotional pain of their restricted lives. Some women became more productive, handling household tasks with drug-induced calm. Others became withdrawn and listless, unable to function without their daily doses. Religious communities presented another layer of complexity. Many devout Christian women saw their medicine taking as God-given relief from suffering. Church ladies groups sometimes recommended specific brands to newcomers. The moral implications of drug use simply didn't register when the substances came from respectable pharmacies with medical labels. Recovery options for addicted women were practically non-existent. The few who recognized their dependency faced social shame if they sought help. Most tried to quit alone, suffering through withdrawal symptoms they didn't understand. Some switched between different preparations thinking variety would solve their problem. Others simply accepted their daily drug use as a permanent necessity. The advertising targeting women became increasingly sophisticated throughout the Victorian era. Companies hired artists to create elegant bottle labels and placed ads in ladies' magazines between recipes and fashion tips. They used testimonials from supposed satisfied customers, creating an illusion of widespread approval among respectable women. Children in these households grew up watching their mothers' daily drug rituals. Young girls learned that adult women needed medicine to cope with life's challenges. This normalized the behavior for the next generation, creating cycles of dependency that lasted decades within families. What makes this chapter of history particularly tragic is how these women were victims of both social expectations and medical ignorance. They were doing exactly what society told them to do, seeking help from legitimate sources for real problems. The solutions just happened to be highly addictive narcotics disguised as respectable medicine. Of course, this feminine drug culture wouldn't last forever. Changes were coming that would challenge everything. Victorian women thought they knew about their daily medicines. But those shifts would bring their own complications. While Victorian families were drowning their children in opium-based syrups and adults were munching cocaine lozenges like candy, something interesting was happening behind the scenes. New drugs were creeping into British medicine cabinets, promising to be safer alternatives to the old favorites. Chloral hydrate and quinine weren't exactly household names yet, but they were about to shake up the drug game in ways nobody expected. Chloral hydrate arrived on the scene around 1869, marketed as the gentleman's sleeping aid. Unlike opium, which knocked people out but often left them groggy and confused the next morning, chloral promised clean, refreshing sleep. Doctors loved this idea. Here was a chemical that could send patients into dreamland without the messy side effects of laudanum addiction. Well, that's what they thought anyway. The stuff looked harmless enough, white crystals that dissolved easily in water or alcohol. Pharmacists called it knockout drops behind the counter, though they'd never admit that to customers. A small dose meant peaceful sleep, a larger dose meant you'd be unconscious for hours. And the weird part is, people trusted it completely because it wasn't opium. Victorian mothers, tired of giving their babies opium-laced cordials, switched to chloral-based remedies with relief. Finally, something that wouldn't turn their children into tiny addicts. What they didn't realize was that chloral hydrate was creating its own problems. The drug worked by depressing the central nervous system, and overdoses could stop breathing entirely. But since it wasn't opium, families assumed it was perfectly safe. Then there's quinine, which had a completely different story. Extracted from cinchona bark, quinine was already famous for treating malaria in British colonies. But Victorian doctors discovered it worked for all kinds of fevers, not just tropical diseases. Suddenly, quinine tonics were everywhere, replacing opium-based fever remedies in medicine cabinets across Britain. The marketing was brilliant. Quinine came from exotic South American trees, which made it sound both natural and sophisticated. Pharmaceutical companies sold it as Peruvian bark extract or fever tree medicine, playing up its jungle origins. Unlike the harsh, bitter taste of laudanum, quinine had a distinctly bitter flavor that somehow convinced people it was working harder. But here's where things get interesting. Some Victorian families started mixing their old drug habits with new ones. They'd take chloral hydrate for sleep, quinine for fevers, and still keep a bottle of laudanum around for emergencies. Medicine cabinets became chemistry experiments, with parents combining different substances based on whatever illness struck their household. Doctors were split on these new alternatives. Progressive physicians embraced chloral and quinine as scientific advances, proof that medicine was evolving beyond crude opium preparations. Conservative doctors remained suspicious, arguing that opium had worked for centuries and these newfangled chemicals were unproven. Medical journals published heated debates about whether traditional remedies should be abandoned for modern alternatives. The transition wasn't smooth. Families who switched to chloral hydrate sometimes discovered it was just as addictive as opium, only in different ways. Instead of the dreamy euphoria of laudanum addiction, chloral created a desperate need for unconsciousness. People became dependent on artificial sleep, unable to rest naturally without their nightly dose of knockout drops. Quinine had its own surprises. Large doses caused ringing in the ears, dizziness, and temporary blindness, side effects Victorian doctors called cinchonism, after the tree bark's scientific name. But since these symptoms were different from opium's problems, many families considered them acceptable trade-offs for fever relief. The real game-changer was how these drugs affected social attitudes toward medication. Chloral and quinine looked modern and scientific compared to traditional opium remedies. Taking these newer drugs felt progressive, like embracing the future of medicine. Victorian families could distance themselves from old-fashioned drug habits while still medicating themselves heavily. Traveling medicine shows adapted quickly to these trends. Hawkers began selling scientific sleep aids and botanical fever cures alongside their traditional opium preparations. They'd set up elaborate displays showing crystalline chloral hydrate next to exotic cinchona bark samples, making their mobile pharmacies look like chemistry laboratories. What's fascinating is how the shift toward these alternatives created new patterns of drug use without eliminating old ones. Instead of replacing opium entirely, chloral and quinine expanded the Victorian medicine cabinet. Families now had specialized drugs for specific problems: chloral for sleep, quinine for fever, laudanum for pain, creating more complex medication routines. The pharmaceutical industry noticed these changing preferences and adapted their marketing accordingly. Advertisements began emphasizing scientific discovery and natural origins rather than just promising miraculous cures. Drug companies realized that Victorian consumers wanted to feel smart about their medication choices, not just desperate for relief. As these newer alternatives gained popularity, they set the stage for even more dramatic changes in British drug culture. The success of chloral and quinine proved that Victorian families were ready to embrace new medications, especially when they promised to be safer than traditional remedies. But the biggest shock was still coming, and it would arrive in the form of a drug that made everything else look harmless by comparison. The funny thing about moral panic, it usually starts with the people who were happily selling the problem in the first place. By the 1880s, the same pharmacists who had been hawking opium like candy began wringing their hands about drug addiction. What changed their minds wasn't sudden enlightenment. It was dead customers. Pharmacists noticed patterns their Victorian ancestors had missed entirely. Customers buying laudanum every few days instead of once a month. Mothers purchasing increasingly large bottles of Godfrey's cordial. Working men who couldn't function without their morning opium tonic. The signs were everywhere, but it took decades for anyone to connect the dots. Medical journals started publishing uncomfortable truths. The British Medical Journal ran articles with titles like "The Opium Habit Among Respectable Families" and "Cocaine Dependency in Professional Classes." These weren't stories about foreign opium dens or criminal behavior. These were discussions about addiction spreading through Britain's middle class like a quiet epidemic. Dr. Norman Kerr became one of the loudest voices calling for change. He founded the Society for the Study of Inebriety in 1884, treating drug addiction as a medical condition rather than moral weakness. This was revolutionary thinking. Before Kerr, most people believed addiction meant you lacked willpower or had weak character. His research suggested otherwise. Addiction was an illness that could strike anyone, regardless of social class or moral standing. But changing minds proved harder than changing laws. Many doctors still prescribed opium for everything from headaches to heartbreak. Why? Because it worked, at least temporarily. Patients felt better, stopped complaining, and praised their physicians. The long-term consequences took months or years to appear, and by then most doctors blamed the patient rather than the treatment. Professional medical organizations faced a dilemma. They knew their members were creating addicts, sometimes accidentally, sometimes through ignorance. Yet admitting this publicly would damage the profession's reputation and potentially reduce patient trust. Medical ethics committees formed to address these concerns, but their meetings remained private and their recommendations voluntary. Pharmaceutical companies fought back against growing criticism with clever marketing. They created improved formulations that supposedly reduced addiction risk while maintaining effectiveness. Dover's powder claimed to use safer opium preparations. Cocaine manufacturers advertised non-habit-forming versions that contained slightly less cocaine but added alcohol for extra appeal. The real pressure came from families dealing with addiction firsthand. Wives wrote letters to medical journals describing husbands who couldn't work without laudanum. Parents shared stories of children who screamed without their daily dose of soothing syrup. These personal accounts forced the medical community to confront uncomfortable realities about their prescribing practices. Religious leaders joined the reform movement, but their approach differed significantly from medical professionals. Churches preached temperance and moral reform, viewing drug dependency as spiritual failing rather than physical illness. This created tension between religious and medical approaches to addiction treatment. Doctors wanted to study the problem scientifically, ministers wanted to pray it away. Pharmacists found themselves caught in the middle. They understood drugs better than most doctors, having mixed and dispensed them for years. Many noticed that certain customers showed clear signs of dependency: trembling hands, desperate behavior when supplies ran low, increasing tolerance requiring larger doses. Yet professional guidelines didn't exist for handling these situations. The Pharmaceutical Society of Great Britain began developing ethical codes for drug dispensing. These early guidelines suggested pharmacists should track repeat customers and question suspicious purchases. However, enforcement remained voluntary, and many chemists ignored recommendations that might reduce their profits. Women's temperance organizations became unlikely allies in drug reform efforts. Groups originally focused on alcohol prohibition expanded their mission to include opium and cocaine concerns. They organized campaigns highlighting addiction's impact on families, particularly children. Their emotional appeals often proved more effective than dry medical statistics at changing public opinion. Parliamentary debates reflected growing awareness but little decisive action. Politicians acknowledged addiction problems while avoiding responsibility for creating them through lax regulation. Committee hearings featured testimony from reformed addicts, concerned physicians, and defensive pharmaceutical manufacturers. Everyone agreed something needed changing. Nobody wanted to sacrifice profits or convenience. Medical schools slowly began teaching about addiction risks, though the curriculum remained limited. Young doctors learned basic pharmacology, but received little training in recognizing dependency or managing withdrawal symptoms. This educational gap persisted well into the 20th century, contributing to ongoing prescription problems. International pressure also influenced British attitudes. Other countries were implementing stricter drug controls, making Britain appear backward by comparison. Medical tourism developed as people traveled to Britain specifically to access drugs unavailable elsewhere. This embarrassed reform-minded professionals who wanted Britain to lead rather than lag in medical ethics. Progress happened gradually rather than dramatically. Individual doctors changed their prescribing habits after witnessing addiction's devastating effects. Pharmacists began refusing suspicious purchases, despite potential profit loss. Families shared cautionary stories that slowly shifted social attitudes toward drug use. The real breakthrough would come through legislation, but that story involves international treaties, political pressure, and a growing understanding of addiction's true nature. The medical profession was finally waking up to problems they had helped create, though solutions remained frustratingly elusive. Deep in a London laboratory in 1874, chemist C. Alder Wright was tinkering with morphine molecules. He wasn't trying to create the world's most notorious drug. Wright was simply curious about what would happen if he cooked morphine with a chemical called acetic anhydride for several hours. What emerged from his experiment would eventually kill millions. Wright called his creation tetraacetyl morphine, a name that sounds more like a cleaning product than a street drug. The brownish powder didn't look particularly threatening sitting in his laboratory dish, but Wright had accidentally stumbled upon something far more powerful than anything Victorian Britain had seen before. The early animal tests revealed the substance's terrifying strength almost immediately. Rabbits and dogs given tiny doses fell into such deep sleep that researchers struggled to wake them. Their breathing slowed to dangerous levels. Some animals never woke up at all. Wright documented his findings in a dry scientific paper, noting the marked sedative action of his new compound. Then he moved on to other projects. For over 2 decades, tetraacetyl morphine sat forgotten in medical journals, waiting for someone to recognize its potential. Victorian doctors were still busy prescribing opium and laudanum to anyone who walked through their doors. Why would they need something stronger? Opium already worked wonders for crying babies, aching backs and sleepless nights. The medical establishment saw no reason to mess with success, but Wright's creation wouldn't stay buried forever. By the 1890s, pharmaceutical companies had begun hunting for new products to sell. The Bayer Company in Germany, yes, the same folks who would later bring you aspirin, stumbled across Wright's old research. They decided to take his forgotten compound and run their own tests. Bayer's researchers quickly realized they had found something extraordinary. The drug was roughly 3 times more potent than morphine. It crossed into the brain faster than any opiate they'd tested. Users reported an intense rush of euphoria, followed by hours of peaceful numbness. Marketing executives at Bayer saw dollar signs dancing in their heads. They renamed Wright's tetra-acetyl morphine, something catchier, something that suggested strength and heroism. They called it heroin, derived from the German word heroisch, meaning heroic. The name couldn't have been more ironic. Early medical trials in the late 1890s focused on heroin's potential as a cough suppressant. Doctors found it worked brilliantly at stopping persistent coughs that kept patients awake at night. Better yet, it seemed to lack opium's constipating effects. Some physicians believed they had found the perfect replacement for morphine. Letters between Victorian doctors reveal their growing excitement about heroin's medical possibilities. One London physician wrote to a colleague in 1898, describing heroin as remarkably effective for treating respiratory ailments. Another noted that patients seemed to prefer heroin over other pain medications. What they didn't understand was heroin's addiction potential. The drug's ability to cross the blood-brain barrier so efficiently meant users developed tolerance incredibly quickly. Within days of regular use, patients needed higher doses to achieve the same effects. Within weeks, many couldn't function without it. Victorian medical journals from 1899 and 1900 contain the first worried reports about heroin's side effects. Doctors began noting that some patients became unusually dependent on their heroin prescriptions. Others complained of severe withdrawal symptoms when they tried to stop taking it. But the warnings came too late. Heroin had already begun its march into Victorian medicine cabinets. Pharmaceutical advertisements in British newspapers started featuring heroin prominently by 1900. Companies marketed it as a safe alternative to morphine, perfect for treating everything from tuberculosis to asthma. Some ads specifically targeted mothers, suggesting heroin could safely quiet coughing children. The dosages recommended in these early advertisements would terrify modern doctors. Victorian physicians routinely prescribed amounts that would be considered dangerous by today's standards. They had no understanding of heroin's narrow margin between therapeutic effect and overdose. Criminal networks hadn't yet discovered heroin's street value. Unlike opium, which had been sold illegally for decades, heroin remained primarily a medical product during its early years. Most users obtained it through legitimate prescriptions from well-meaning doctors. This medical legitimacy made heroin seem safer than it actually was. Patients trusted their physicians completely. If Dr. Smith prescribed heroin for bronchitis, it must be perfectly safe. This blind faith would prove deadly for thousands of Victorian families. The first heroin addicts weren't street criminals or social outcasts. They were respectable middle-class patients who had followed their doctor's orders exactly. Housewives taking heroin for chronic coughs, businessmen using it for back pain, children given it for whooping cough. Wright's forgotten laboratory experiment was about to transform from medical curiosity into social catastrophe. But in those early days, as the 19th century drew to a close, most Victorians remained blissfully unaware of the monster that had been unleashed. While doctors debated heroin's proper medical applications, British workers were discovering their own relationship with dangerous substances, and their workplace habits would shock even seasoned drug reformers. The factory whistle blew at dawn, and thousands of workers shuffled through the gates for another brutal day, 12-hour shifts. Dangerous machinery, barely enough pay to feed a family, but Victorian workers had a secret weapon against the grinding misery of industrial life: drugs from the local chemist. Workers didn't just pop a pill here and there, they relied on opiates like lifelines. The morning started with a spoonful of laudanum mixed into tea. Lunch break meant another dose of something strong enough to numb aching backs and bleeding hands. By evening, exhausted laborers lined up at pharmacy counters, buying bottles of energy tonics that were basically liquid cocaine mixed with alcohol. Factory owners noticed something interesting. Workers on drug-laced medicines could push through longer hours without complaining. Some bosses actually encouraged their staff to dose up before shifts. Why deal with worker strikes when you could just drug the pain away? Mill supervisors kept bottles of patent medicines in their offices, handing them out like candy to anyone who looked ready to collapse. The advertisements targeted tired workers directly, feeling worn down by hard labor. Try Dr. Morrison's Miracle Tonic. These ads promised incredible things. More energy, less hunger, freedom from the constant ache of factory work. What they didn't mention was the opium and cocaine hiding in every bottle. Workers bought into the promises completely. Entire factory floors became dependent on their daily doses. Textile mills, coal mines, steel foundries, they all had the same pattern. Morning medicine rounds, afternoon pick-me-ups, evening pain relief. The cycle never stopped. Then there were the women working in match factories, breathing toxic fumes all day. Their solution? Opium drops that dulled everything, including the warning signs of phosphorus poisoning. Female workers in clothing factories used cocaine lozenges to stay alert during endless sewing shifts. The drugs masked dangerous working conditions that should have sparked outrage. Some factory towns saw entire neighborhoods hooked on workplace medicines. Families passed down drug habits like family recipes. Fathers taught sons which tonics worked best for heavy lifting. Mothers shared opium remedies with daughters heading into mill work. The knowledge spread through working communities like wildfire. But here's where things got really twisted. Supervisors sometimes withheld medicine access as punishment. Miss too many days, no more laudanum for you. Complain about safety. Your cocaine tonic privileges get revoked. Drugs became tools of workplace control, keeping desperate workers in line. The pharmaceutical companies loved this captive market. They created special industrial strength formulas marketed specifically to laborers, bottles designed to fit in work pockets, concentrated doses that lasted through double shifts, special measuring caps so workers could dose themselves without missing production quotas. Factory medical officers, the few that existed, often prescribed these dangerous cocktails themselves. A broken finger? Here's some morphine. Chronic cough from textile fibers. Try this opium syrup. Exhaustion from 16-hour days. Cocaine tablets will fix you right up. Medical professionals became drug dealers in white coats. The really disturbing part was how addiction spread through workplace social networks. Workers shared their favorite remedies during breaks. They traded different brands like baseball cards. New employees learned the drug routine from experienced hands within their first week on the job. Some factories developed their own internal drug economies. Workers with access to stronger medicines became informal dealers. Foremen who controlled the workplace medicine cabinet gained extra power over their crews. The whole system created layers of dependency that went far beyond just chemical addiction. Mining communities saw the worst of it. Underground work meant constant pain, fear, and exhaustion. Miners dosed themselves heavily before descending into dangerous shafts. Coal dust mixed with opium created respiratory problems that required even stronger medicines. The cycle of drug dependence became impossible to break. Railway workers faced similar pressures. Operating dangerous machinery while high on opiates led to numerous accidents. But the alternative, working completely sober through brutal conditions, seemed even worse to most laborers. Safety took a backseat to survival. Manufacturing towns developed distinct drug cultures around their dominant industries. Pottery workers preferred certain opium mixtures. Metal workers had their favorite cocaine preparations. Each trade developed specialized drug knowledge passed down through generations of workers. The strangest part, many workers genuinely believed these medicines made them healthier. Opium suppressed their appetites, helping families stretch food budgets. Cocaine boosted energy levels, making workers feel superhuman. The immediate benefits masked long-term health disasters waiting to unfold. By the 1880s, workplace drug dependency had become so common that some employers started budgeting for it. Factory medical expenses included regular orders of laudanum and cocaine preparations. Worker productivity calculations factored in drug costs as standard operating expenses. The numbers tell the real story of how deeply drugs penetrated Victorian industrial life. But before we dive into those shocking statistics, there's something else you need to know about just how much of these dangerous substances people were actually consuming. When people started paying attention to what Victorian Britain was actually consuming, the numbers were absolutely staggering. Drug imports didn't just increase between 1821 and 1851. They exploded like a fireworks show nobody saw coming. Opium imports alone jumped from roughly £22,000 per year in the 1820s to over £280,000 annually by the 1850s. That's more than 12 times the amount in just 3 decades. Every port city became a gateway for narcotic shipments that would make modern customs officials faint. But here's where it gets really wild. These weren't secret smuggling operations. Ships docked openly with cargo manifests, listing medicinal opium right next to tea and wool imports. Port authorities treated drug shipments like any other commercial goods. No special permits, no health department oversight. Nothing. Regional consumption patterns revealed even more shocking truths. In some Lancashire mill towns, nearly 90% of households regularly purchased opium-based medicines. Local chemists reported selling more laudanum than aspirin. Working-class families spent approximately 3 to 5% of their weekly income on patent medicines containing narcotics. The baby market alone generated massive profits that would embarrass modern pharmaceutical companies. Godfrey's cordial sales reached over 200,000 bottles monthly in London during peak years. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup wasn't far behind, with regional distributors reporting constant stock shortages. Then there's the truly disturbing infant mortality statistics. Coroners in industrial cities began noticing patterns by the 1840s. Children under 2 showed suspicious symptoms in death reports: respiratory depression, unusually deep sleep patterns before death, and what doctors called failure to thrive syndrome. Manchester kept particularly detailed records that survive today. Between 1839 and 1849, infant deaths linked to soothing preparations increased by roughly 400%. Most families never connected their medicine bottles to their children's health problems. The dots weren't being connected because nobody was looking for patterns yet. Patent medicine companies, meanwhile, were swimming in cash like Victorian drug lords. Profits from narcotic-based remedies often exceeded 2,000% markup from raw ingredients. A bottle of laudanum costing 3p to produce sold for 2 shillings or more. Basic economics made drug dealing incredibly attractive to legitimate businesses. Sales records from major pharmacy chains show remarkable geographic differences too. Rural areas actually consumed more opium per capita than cities in many cases. Traveling medicine sellers reported higher profits in countryside visits than urban stops. Farmers apparently trusted traditional remedies more than city folk who had access to newer medical opinions. Women's consumption patterns created another statistical nightmare entirely. Surveys conducted by concerned doctors in the 1850s suggested that middle-class women used patent medicines containing opiates at nearly twice the rate of men. Female complaints generated enormous demand for narcotic-laced treatments marketed specifically to housewives and mothers. Workplace drug use statistics remain harder to pin down, but factory owner testimonials paint a clear picture. Mill supervisors reported that productivity actually increased when workers had access to opiate-based tonics. Some companies provided free access to medicinal preparations as employee benefits. The correlation between long shifts and drug dependency wasn't considered a problem, it was considered a solution. Cocaine's arrival created entirely new market segments almost overnight. Within 5 years of commercial availability in the 1880s, cocaine preparations appeared in roughly 60% of major pharmacy inventories. Dentists ordered cocaine supplies faster than suppliers could import raw materials from South America. Regional import records show London receiving approximately £15,000 of processed cocaine annually by 1890. Liverpool and Bristol weren't far behind, with growing demand from both medical professionals and curious consumers willing to experiment with the miracle cure. But the most telling statistics emerged when consumption patterns finally started declining in the 1890s. The drop wasn't gradual, it fell off a cliff once public awareness campaigns gained momentum. Opium sales decreased by roughly 70% in major cities between 1890 and 1900. Drug company profit reports from this period reveal panic among manufacturers. Several major patent medicine producers went bankrupt when public opinion shifted against narcotic ingredients. Companies scrambled to reformulate popular products with less controversial substances, often with disastrous results for brand loyalty. International trade records provide the final piece of this statistical puzzle. Britain's opium consumption per capita during peak Victorian years exceeded modern prescription opioid usage rates in contemporary America. An entire nation was essentially experimenting with unrestricted drug access on a scale never seen before or since. These numbers weren't just statistics on paper. They represented real families, real children, and real consequences that Victorian society was only beginning to understand. What happened when those consequences became impossible to ignore would reshape medicine forever. But first came the tragic human cost that nobody had bothered to count. The death toll was staggering. Victorian Britain didn't just have a drug problem, it had a death problem. Babies were dying in their cribs. Children were collapsing in playgrounds, adults were found lifeless in their beds. The very medicines families trusted to heal were often the ones killing them. Infant mortality rates in working-class neighborhoods told a horrific story. In some London districts, nearly 1 in 3 babies died before their first birthday. Many of these deaths weren't from disease or malnutrition alone. They were from overdoses of Godfrey's cordial, Mother's Friend, and dozens of other opium-laced syrups that parents poured down tiny throats with shocking regularity. The symptoms were unmistakable once doctors started paying attention. Babies given regular doses of these soothing medicines developed what physicians called the opium look. Their eyes became glassy and unfocused. Their skin turned pale and waxy. They stopped crying, stopped moving, stopped being babies. Some parents actually celebrated this eerie calm, thinking their medicine was working perfectly. Then there were the children who survived, but carried lifelong damage. Kids who'd been dosed with opium from birth often couldn't walk properly by age 3. Their growth was stunted. Their minds developed slowly, if at all. Teachers in Victorian schools began noticing patterns. Certain children from certain neighborhoods seemed perpetually drowsy, unable to focus, struggling with basic learning that came naturally to others. Working-class areas suffered the worst casualties. Poor families relied most heavily on cheap patent medicines because they couldn't afford proper medical care. When little Mary down the street stopped breathing after a dose of cough syrup, neighbors didn't blame the medicine. They assumed she was weak or sickly. The real killer was hiding in plain sight on kitchen shelves across Britain. Adult deaths followed grimmer patterns. Factory workers who'd been using opium-laced tonics to get through 16-hour shifts sometimes never made it home. They'd collapse at their machines, victims of what we'd now recognize as respiratory depression. But Victorian foremen just saw lazy workers who couldn't handle honest labor. Women faced particular dangers during childbirth. Doctors routinely prescribed heavy opium doses to manage labor pain, often with fatal results. Both mothers and babies died from overdoses that medical professionals considered standard treatment. Birth complications that might have been manageable became death sentences when combined with massive narcotic doses. The geographic patterns were telling. Rural areas saw fewer drug deaths initially, but as traveling medicine sellers spread their wares to countryside villages, the death toll followed. Farmers who'd never seen opium before were suddenly buying bottles by the dozen. Their children paid the price for this deadly inexperience. Medical records from the era paint an increasingly disturbing picture as the century progressed. Hospital admission logs show mysterious increases in sleeping sickness cases, patients who arrived unconscious and never woke up. Morgue records list cause of death as natural causes, or weak constitution for what were clearly drug overdoses. Some Victorian doctors began connecting the dots by the 1860s. Dr. William Hardwick of Manchester published a shocking study tracking infant deaths in his district. He found that families using the most patent medicines had the highest child mortality rates. His research was largely ignored by colleagues who profited from prescribing these same deadly concoctions. The cognitive damage proved just as devastating as the deaths. Children who survived heavy opium exposure often developed what modern medicine would recognize as permanent brain damage. They struggled with memory, coordination, and basic reasoning skills. Victorian society simply labeled them slow or feeble-minded without understanding the real cause. Geographic clusters of these damaged children appeared around major drug distribution centers. Liverpool, with its massive import trade, saw entire neighborhoods of cognitively impaired kids. London's East End became notorious for producing generations of children who seemed mentally dulled from birth. Even more disturbing were the accidental poisonings. Medicine bottles rarely carried dosage instructions or warnings. Parents guessed at appropriate amounts, often with tragic results. A teaspoon became a tablespoon. 1 dose became 3. Children found pretty bottles and drank the contents like candy. The class divide in drug deaths became increasingly obvious as medical knowledge improved. Wealthy families had access to doctors who understood proper dosing and safer alternatives. Poor families relied on folklore, guesswork, and whatever the local druggist recommended. The death rate reflected this brutal inequality. By the 1870s, some newspapers began reporting on suspicious patterns of infant deaths. The connection to popular medicines was becoming harder to ignore. Parents started questioning whether their trusted remedies might be harming rather than helping their children. But recognizing the problem was only the beginning. The real challenge would be convincing an entire society to abandon medical practices that had seemed perfectly normal for decades. The path toward actual drug regulation would prove even more complicated than anyone imagined. The year 1868 marked a turning point that most Victorians barely noticed at first. Parliament quietly passed the Poisons Act, Britain's first real attempt to control what people could buy from their local chemist. The days of purchasing opium as easily as buying bread were officially numbered. Well, officially being the key word here. The new law required pharmacists to keep detailed records of anyone buying opium, arsenic, or other dangerous substances. Customers had to sign a register with their name and address. They needed to state their reason for purchasing these drugs. For a society used to complete freedom in their medicine cabinet choices, this felt revolutionary. Some chemists grumbled about the extra paperwork, others welcomed the protection it offered them legally. But here's where things get interesting. The law only applied to registered pharmacists and official shops. Traveling sellers, market stall vendors, and backstreet dealers faced no such restrictions. They continued selling their wares exactly as before. The result, a two-tier system that pushed many customers toward less regulated sources. Licensed pharmacists found themselves in an awkward position. They watched potential customers walk away rather than sign the poison register. Pride played a role here. Many Victorians considered it embarrassing to have their opium purchases officially recorded. What would the neighbors think if word got out? The social stigma began shifting, slowly but surely. Then there's the enforcement problem that plagued these early drug laws. Police officers had little training in identifying illegal drug sales. They rarely patrolled market areas looking for unlicensed medicine sellers. Most constables couldn't tell the difference between legitimate patent medicines and dangerous concoctions. The black market thrived in this enforcement vacuum. Clever sellers found ways around the new restrictions almost immediately. They renamed their products using fancy Latin terms that disguised the opium content. Morpheus drops and Oriental sleep remedy became popular euphemisms. Customers learned the code words quickly. Pharmacists developed their own workarounds too, selling cough mixtures that happened to contain substantial amounts of laudanum. The weird part is how slowly public attitudes actually changed. Despite the new laws, many families continued treating opium as a household necessity. They simply bought it from different sources. Street vendors did booming business selling traditional remedies to customers who avoided the official shops. These unregulated mixtures often contained higher drug concentrations than the pharmacy versions. Record keeping became a fascinating window into Victorian drug habits. The poison registers that survived from this period reveal surprising patterns. Wealthy customers bought smaller quantities more frequently, suggesting careful dosing. Working-class buyers purchased larger amounts less often, likely sharing with extended family members. Women signed the registers far more often than men, reflecting their role as family healthcare managers. Some pharmacists took the new responsibilities seriously and began educating their customers about proper dosages. They printed warning labels and offered advice about safe use. Others simply went through the motions, keeping minimal records and asking few questions. The quality of implementation varied wildly from shop to shop. Local magistrates struggled with prosecuting violations of the new law. What exactly constituted illegal drug selling? How much opium was too much for household use? The legal system lacked precedents for these cases. Many early prosecutions failed because judges couldn't determine appropriate penalties. Drug sellers learned they faced little real consequence for ignoring the regulations. Children presented another enforcement challenge entirely. The law didn't specify age restrictions for drug purchases. 12-year-olds could still legally buy opium if they signed the register. Many young people simply lied about their ages or purposes for buying drugs. Pharmacists rarely questioned obvious deceptions, especially when business was slow. The Poisons Act also created unexpected geographical divisions in drug access. Rural areas maintained their traditional medicine practices longer than cities. Country folk continued buying from traveling sellers who visited monthly. Urban residents faced stricter oversight from licensed pharmacists who operated under closer government scrutiny. This rural-urban split influenced drug culture patterns for decades. Professional medical organizations initially opposed the new restrictions. They argued that limiting drug access would harm legitimate patients who needed pain relief. The British Medical Association worried about government interference in medical practice. These concerns proved largely unfounded. but they slowed acceptance of the regulatory changes. International drug traders adapted their business models to work within the new legal framework. They established relationships with licensed importers and distributors who could handle the paperwork requirements. The global opium trade continued flowing into Britain, just through more official channels. Profits decreased slightly, but demand remained strong enough to sustain the industry. What nobody anticipated was how this first small step toward drug regulation would grow into something much larger. The 1868 Poisons Act established important legal precedents about government authority over medicine sales. It created the bureaucratic framework that future drug laws would build upon. More importantly, it began shifting public consciousness about the dangers of unrestricted drug access. The black market response to these early regulations revealed just how deeply drug dependency had taken root in Victorian society. But the legal framework was now in place, and social attitudes were beginning their slow transformation toward our modern understanding of drug control. The wealthy Victorian lady clutched her silver medicine case, filled with precisely measured doses of laudanum prescribed by her private physician. Down the street, a factory worker's wife mixed raw opium powder into gin, hoping it would help her sick child sleep through another night of hunger. Same drug, completely different worlds. Rich Victorians had access to something the poor could only dream of: information. Wealthy families could afford doctors who actually understood drug dangers. These physicians had attended medical schools, read international journals, and knew the difference between therapeutic doses and deadly ones. They prescribed carefully measured amounts of opium and cocaine, monitored their patients for signs of addiction, and adjusted treatments when problems arose. The upper classes also had alternatives. When a wealthy Victorian felt anxious, they might visit expensive spas, take trips to the countryside, or consult specialists who offered non-drug treatments. Their medicine cabinets contained precisely labeled bottles with clear instructions, often imported from the finest pharmacies in London or Paris. But here's where it gets interesting. Poor families operated on completely different rules. They couldn't afford doctors, so they relied on folk wisdom passed down through generations. Grandmother swore by her opium mixture for teething babies. The neighbor lady claimed her laudanum recipe cured everything from headaches to heartbreak. These weren't malicious people. They genuinely believed they were helping their families with the best knowledge available to them. Working-class neighborhoods developed their own drug cultures. Street sellers knew exactly which mixtures sold best to tired factory workers. Corner shops stocked the cheapest opium preparations, often diluted with dangerous substances to maximize profits. Quality control, that was a luxury for people who could afford better options. Then there's the geographic divide. City dwellers, regardless of class, had more access to newer information about drug dangers. Urban newspapers occasionally printed warnings about overdoses. City pharmacists might refuse sales to obviously intoxicated customers. Rural areas remained stuck in older traditions much longer. Village chemists continued selling the same preparations their predecessors had offered for decades. Middle-class doctors often criticized working-class drug habits without understanding the underlying reasons. Easy enough to condemn opium use when you've never worked 16-hour shifts in a textile mill. These critics failed to recognize that many poor families used drugs not for pleasure, but for survival. Opium dulled the pain of industrial injuries that couldn't be properly treated. Laudanum helped exhausted mothers function despite malnutrition and overwork. The weird part is how social norms varied between classes. Wealthy opium users were considered eccentric or artistic. Poor opium users were labeled as morally deficient. Same substance, same addiction potential, completely different social judgments. Victorian society seemed perfectly comfortable with this double standard. Drug companies understood these class differences perfectly. They marketed expensive, elegantly packaged preparations to wealthy customers while flooding working-class areas with cheap, potent alternatives. Advertisement strategies varied dramatically based on target audiences. Wealthy customers received sophisticated medical language and doctor endorsements. Poor customers got simple promises of quick relief and low prices. Education played a huge role in these disparities. Wealthy Victorians could read medical journals, attend lectures, and discuss drug risks with educated friends. Many poor Victorians couldn't read at all, relying entirely on oral traditions and street knowledge. When new information about drug dangers emerged, it took years to filter down to working-class communities. Let's not forget the role of shame in different social circles. Wealthy families could afford private treatment for addiction problems. They had country estates where troubled relatives could quietly recover away from public scrutiny. Poor families had no such options. Addiction problems played out in crowded tenements where privacy was impossible and treatment was unavailable. The changing social norms around drug use moved at different speeds across class lines. By the 1880s, many middle-class families had already reduced their opium use based on new medical warnings. Working-class families continued traditional practices well into the 1890s, partly because alternative treatments remained expensive and inaccessible. This created a strange situation where drug laws affected different classes unequally. When the 1868 Poisons Act required record-keeping for opium sales, wealthy customers simply switched to private physicians who prescribed legal alternatives. Poor customers turned to black market sellers who offered no safety guarantees whatsoever. Economic factors intensified these differences. A wealthy family might spend extra money on safer medicines or seek multiple medical opinions. Poor families bought whatever was cheapest, regardless of quality or safety. Market forces essentially created separate drug economies for different social classes. Victorian drug habits revealed deeper truths about social inequality. Access to information, medical care, and safer alternatives all depended heavily on economic status. The same substances that killed working-class children were used relatively safely by families who could afford proper medical supervision. But even as class differences shaped drug use patterns, something bigger was starting to change across all of Victorian society. The very companies that had profited from unrestricted drug sales were about to discover the power of advertising in ways that would transform how all Victorians thought about medicine. Victorian newspapers were absolutely packed with drug advertisements. Open any paper from the 1860s and you'd find at least a dozen ads promising miracle cures containing opium, laudanum, or cocaine. These weren't tucked away in tiny corner spaces either. Drug companies bought full-page spreads, complete with fancy illustrations and bold headlines. The marketing language was wild by today's standards. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup promised to make crying babies perfectly quiet and harmless. Another popular ad declared that chelodine could cure cholera, diarrhea, coughs, asthma, and neuralgia all in one bottle. The best part? Nobody questioned these outrageous claims because there were no rules about what companies could promise. Then there were the slogans that stuck in people's minds. A teaspoon of peace for opium-laced cough syrup. Nature's gentle friend for laudanum drops. The working man's relief for patent medicines loaded with narcotics. These catchy phrases made dangerous drugs sound as harmless as Sunday tea. Companies got creative with their target audiences too. Some ads specifically targeted exhausted mothers, promising that their opium-based cordials would give them blessed hours of rest. Others aimed at factory workers, suggesting that a daily dose of their tonic would make 14-hour shifts bearable. The wealthy weren't forgotten either. High-end magazines featured elegant ads for cocaine lozenges marketed as sophisticated treatments for nervous disorders. But here's where things got really sneaky. Many advertisements deliberately hid what was actually in their products. Instead of listing opium, they'd use fancy Latin names or made-up terms like Oriental Essence or Dover's Miraculous Compound. Parents buying medicine for sick children had no idea they were purchasing powerful narcotics. The bottles themselves rarely listed ingredients clearly, if at all. Drug companies also exploited Victorian society's trust in authority figures. Ads featured fake doctor testimonials praising their products. Dr. Richardson recommends this remedy above all others. Became a standard format, even when no real Dr. Richardson existed. Some companies went further, creating entirely fictional medical colleges to endorse their dangerous concoctions. The timing of these ads was calculated too. Companies flooded newspapers with medicine advertisements during winter months, when coughs and colds were common. They'd increase their cocaine remedy ads during spring, when people complained of fatigue. Smart marketing meant higher profits, regardless of the human cost. Critics did fight back, but they faced an uphill battle. A few brave doctors wrote letters to newspaper editors, warning about misleading drug advertisements. Some even published their own pamphlets, explaining the real dangers of these heavily marketed medicines. However, their voices were often drowned out by the sheer volume of paid advertising. The newspaper industry itself was conflicted. Publishers needed advertising revenue to stay profitable, and drug companies were among their biggest customers. Many editors knew the health claims were questionable, but turning away lucrative advertising contracts wasn't an appealing option. Money talked louder than medical ethics in most cases. Regional differences in advertising were striking. London newspapers featured more sophisticated drug ads targeting educated readers, while rural papers ran simpler advertisements focusing on practical benefits for farming families. Northern industrial cities saw ads emphasizing how pain medicines could help workers power through grueling factory conditions. Some of the most successful drug advertising campaigns became cultural phenomena. Godfrey's cordial ads appeared in virtually every British newspaper for decades. The product became so well known that giving the baby some Godfreys entered everyday language. Parents who had never seen the original advertisements still knew the brand name through word-of-mouth recommendations. The lack of advertising regulations created a Wild West atmosphere where companies could make any claim they wanted. One notorious ad claimed their opium-based elixir could restore youth to the aged and wisdom to the foolish. Another promised their cocaine mixture would banish all earthly troubles permanently. These weren't seen as obvious lies. Many people genuinely believed such claims were possible. Education campaigns slowly began appearing alongside the drug advertisements. Temperance societies started placing their own ads warning about the dangers of pain medicines. Some women's organizations published counter-advertisements explaining how to identify narcotic-laced products. These efforts planted seeds of doubt in consumers' minds. The advertising boom revealed something important about Victorian society's relationship with drugs. People weren't just accidentally stumbling into opium or cocaine use. They were being actively encouraged and manipulated by sophisticated marketing campaigns. The normalization of drug consumption wasn't organic, it was manufactured by companies seeking profits. What makes this advertising frenzy even more remarkable is how it shaped public perception for generations. Victorian drug advertisements didn't just sell products, they sold the idea that chemical solutions could fix any problem. This mentality would influence British attitudes toward medicine and drugs long after the original advertisements disappeared from newspaper pages. While marketing rules were still decades away from implementation, the foundation was being laid for future battles between profit-driven companies and public health advocates. The stage was set for some truly fascinating characters to emerge from this drug-soaked advertising landscape. Victorian Britain had a dirty secret hiding in plain sight. The most celebrated writers, artists and creative minds of the era weren't just sipping tea and penning elegant prose. They were getting high, really high. Samuel Taylor Coleridge, the brilliant poet who gave us Kubla Khan, was completely hooked on laudanum by his 20s. He started taking opium for genuine pain relief, but soon he was consuming massive doses daily. His famous unfinished poem, he claimed it came to him in an opium-induced dream. The guy literally wrote some of English literature's most celebrated verses while off his face on drugs. Thomas de Quincey took things even further. This writer didn't just use opium, he made it his brand. His book Confessions of an English Opium Eater became a bestseller in 1821, detailing his 15-year addiction with shocking honesty. De Quincey described taking enough laudanum daily to kill several people. He'd consume what he called prodigious quantities, and then write about the incredible visions and nightmares that followed. But here's where it gets really wild. These weren't considered scandalous confessions at the time. They were marketing gold. Elizabeth Barrett Browning, one of Victorian England's most respected female poets, relied on laudanum for decades. She started taking it for a spinal injury in her teens, and never stopped. Her husband Robert Browning watched helplessly as she downed bottle after bottle. She'd take 40 drops at a time, enough to knock out a horse. Yet she continued writing passionate love sonnets and complex political poetry while maintaining this massive habit. The creative community treated opium use like a professional requirement. Writers' circles in London would gather for laudanum parties where they'd share their favorite brands and compare effects. They genuinely believed drugs enhanced their artistic abilities. Maybe they weren't entirely wrong. Some of literature's most imaginative works came from these drug-fueled sessions. Charles Dickens kept his opium use quieter, but evidence suggests he regularly visited London's opium dens for research. His vivid descriptions of these places in The Mystery of Edwin Drood show intimate knowledge of the experience. Dickens wrote about the magic lantern effects of opium with the precision of someone who'd been there many times. Edgar Allan Poe, though American, spent time in Britain and influenced the drug culture there. His tales of horror and psychological breakdown reflected his own struggles with laudanum addiction. British writers read his work and saw artistic inspiration, not warning signs. They wanted to achieve that same dark creativity. Wilkie Collins, author of The Moonstone, consumed enormous amounts of laudanum for gout pain. His servants reported finding empty bottles everywhere. Collins would dictate entire chapters while under the influence, creating some of the first detective fiction in English literature. He claimed he couldn't remember writing large portions of his novels. Then there's the peculiar case of Dante Gabriel Rossetti, the pre-Raphaelite painter and poet. After his wife Elizabeth Siddal died from a laudanum overdose, whether accidental or intentional remained unclear, Rossetti dramatically buried his unpublished poems with her body. Years later, guilt-ridden and heavily addicted himself, he had her coffin dug up to retrieve the manuscripts. The papers were reportedly soaked with decay, but still readable. The artistic community's drug habits weren't limited to opium. When cocaine arrived in the 1880s, it created another wave of creative experimentation. Arthur Conan Doyle famously had his character Sherlock Holmes inject cocaine, reflecting real practices among intellectual circles. Recovery options barely existed during this period. Addicted writers faced a brutal choice: continue using and risk death, or attempt withdrawal and potentially lose their creative edge. Most chose to keep using. Francis Thompson, a Catholic poet, lived as a homeless laudanum addict on London streets for 3 years. He sold matches and newspapers to buy drugs, all while writing some of the era's most celebrated religious poetry. His masterpiece, The Hound of Heaven, was composed during the depths of his addiction. What's particularly striking is how these artists documented their experiences. Unlike today's celebrity drug scandals, Victorian creative addiction was treated as almost noble suffering. The public read their confessions with fascination rather than judgment. The literary world's drug culture began shifting in the 1890s as medical understanding improved. Some writers successfully reduced their habits, while others weren't so lucky. The romantic notion of the tortured artist had real consequences: shortened lives, broken relationships, and creative potential lost to chemical dependency. These famous cases of Victorian addiction reveal something important about how society viewed drugs. When respected artists openly used narcotics, it normalized the practice for everyone else. Their stories helped shape public attitudes toward both creativity and chemical substances. But the creative community wasn't the only group developing dangerous drug habits. Victorian medicine cabinets held their own deadly secrets that affected every household in Britain. Walking into a Victorian medicine cabinet was like playing Russian roulette with bottles. No warning labels, no dosage instructions, just mysterious liquids with fancy names that hid their deadly contents. Mrs. Henderson's soothing syrup contained enough opium to knock out a horse. Dr. Bailey's infant quietness packed morphine that would be illegal today. These weren't clearly marked either. The bottles might say for restful sleep or mother's helper without mentioning they contained hardcore narcotics. Children could grab any bottle they wanted. No child-proof caps existed. No locked medicine cabinets. Little Tommy could easily mistake laudanum for cough syrup and accidentally overdose before anyone noticed. The sweet taste of many opium-laced medicines made them even more dangerous for curious kids. Then there were the dosing disasters. Bottles came with vague instructions like take as needed, or a few drops for comfort. What did that even mean? One person's few drops could be another person's overdose. Victorian mothers often guessed at dosages, sometimes giving their babies 10 times the safe amount. The fancy names made everything worse. Laudanum sounded so much more respectable than liquid opium. Dover's powder seemed harmless compared to morphine and ipecac mixture. Drug companies deliberately used these misleading names to make dangerous substances sound like gentle remedies. Well, here's where it gets really wild. Some Victorian families kept bottles of pure cocaine sitting right next to their teacups. Cocaine lozenges were stored in kitchen drawers alongside regular throat drops. Parents had no idea they were housing what we'd now consider a drug den's worth of narcotics. The storage methods were equally reckless. Many families kept all their medicines in wooden boxes or simple shelves. No separation between dangerous drugs and harmless remedies. Opium tinctures sat next to harmless herbal teas. One mix-up could prove fatal. Let's not forget the traveling medicine show bottles that ended up in homes. These often contained mystery ingredients that even the sellers didn't fully understand. Some bottles held mixtures of opium, cocaine, alcohol, and mercury. The labels rarely listed all ingredients, leaving families completely in the dark about what they were consuming. Victorian medicine cabinets also suffered from the more is better mentality. Families stockpiled multiple opium-based medicines thinking they were building a good pharmacy. Instead, they were creating a toxic warehouse. Mrs. Smith might have Godfrey's cordial, laudanum drops, Dover's powder, and cocaine throat tablets all sitting together. The weird part is how normalized this chaos became. Victorian families treated these dangerous substances like we treat aspirin today. They'd casually offer guests a calming drop of laudanum, or suggest cocaine lozenges for a scratchy throat. The medicine cabinet was basically a neighborhood drug dispensary. Accidents happened constantly. Children drank entire bottles thinking they were treats. Adults double-dosed when they forgot they'd already taken medicine. Elderly family members mixed up bottles in poor lighting and took the wrong substances entirely. These weren't rare incidents. They were everyday occurrences in Victorian households. But why did families tolerate such dangerous setups? Simple answer: they didn't know better. Medical knowledge was limited. Drug addiction wasn't understood. The concept of overdose was barely recognized. Most people believed that if a medicine was sold legally, it must be safe. The medicine cabinet situation got even more dangerous when servants were involved. Maids and housekeepers often had access to family medicines. Some helped themselves to opium-laced remedies without understanding the risks. Others accidentally gave children the wrong medicines when parents weren't around. Victorian medicine cabinets reflected the era's Wild West approach to healthcare. No regulations meant no safety standards. No understanding of addiction meant no precautions. No proper labeling meant constant confusion. It was a perfect storm of medical chaos sitting in every family's home. Some families tried to organize their medicines better. They'd separate children's remedies from adult medicines without realizing both categories contained dangerous narcotics. Others attempted to lock up their most expensive medicines, accidentally protecting the cocaine while leaving opium accessible. The medicine cabinet dangers extended beyond just the drugs themselves. Glass bottles broke easily, creating cuts alongside chemical poisoning. Cork stoppers deteriorated, allowing medicines to spoil or become contaminated. Metal containers sometimes reacted with their contents, creating new toxic compounds. Victorian medicine cabinets were basically time bombs waiting to explode. Every family had one. Every family used it regularly. And every family risked accidental overdoses, poisoning, or addiction every time they opened those innocent-looking bottles. Makes sense, right? When you combine powerful drugs, zero safety standards, misleading labels, and complete ignorance about addiction, disaster becomes inevitable. These medicine cabinet nightmares couldn't continue forever. Public awareness was slowly building, and the mounting casualties were becoming impossible to ignore. Soon newspapers would begin documenting the true scope of Victorian drug tragedies, forcing society to confront the deadly reality hiding in their own homes. The turning point didn't happen overnight. Victorian Britain spent decades happily drugging itself senseless before anyone bothered to ask if this was actually a good idea. But by the 1870s, something was shifting in the air, and it wasn't just the opium smoke. Newspapers started telling different stories. Instead of cheerful advertisements for Mother's Little Helper and cocaine lozenges, editors began running darker headlines. Child found dead after taking soothing syrup. Factory worker dies from laudanum overdose. Infant mortality rises in districts where patent medicine's popular. The same papers that had happily taken money from drug manufacturers were suddenly asking uncomfortable questions. Makes sense, right? When dead babies start piling up, even the most profit-focused society eventually notices. The shift wasn't just coming from journalists either. Doctors who had spent years prescribing opium for everything from headaches to heartbreak were starting to connect some disturbing dots. Dr. Thomas Albert, a respected physician, wrote scathing articles about the criminal carelessness of giving narcotics to children. He wasn't alone. Medical journals that once praised the versatility of laudanum began publishing case studies of addiction and overdose. Parliament couldn't ignore the growing chorus of concern forever. Members who had previously dismissed drug regulation as government overreach found themselves facing angry constituents. Mothers whose babies had died from harmless soothing syrups demanded answers. Factory owners complained that their workers were too drugged to function properly. Even the upper classes, who had long viewed opium use as fashionable, were beginning to see the less glamorous side of addiction. The debates in Parliament were fierce. Traditional voices argued that regulating medicines would interfere with personal freedom and hurt legitimate businesses. Why should the government tell people what they could and couldn't buy? But reformers painted vivid pictures of nurseries filled with unnaturally quiet babies and working-class neighborhoods where entire families had become dependent on patent medicines just to get through each day. Then there were the statistics that nobody could argue with. Import records showed that Britain was consuming staggering amounts of opium, far more per person than any other country in Europe. Death certificates increasingly listed narcotic poisoning as a cause of death, especially among children under 5. Insurance companies started refusing to pay out policies when opium was involved, claiming the deaths were preventable. Well, the insurance angle got people's attention fast. Religious leaders jumped into the fray with their own brand of moral outrage. Sunday sermons began condemning the demon drugs that were destroying Christian families. Methodist preachers organized campaigns against patent medicine manufacturers. Even the Anglican Church, typically more reserved, issued statements calling opium use a grave moral danger to society. But here's where things got interesting. The pushback from ordinary families was enormous. Women who had relied on laudanum for monthly pains weren't about to give up their relief because some politician decided it was dangerous. Working men who used opium-laced tonics to cope with brutal factory conditions saw the reform movement as another way the upper classes were trying to control their lives. Many argued that if wealthy people could afford doctors and proper medical care, they shouldn't dictate what remedies poor families could use. The generational divide was just as sharp. Older Victorians had grown up when opium was as normal as tea. They'd used it for decades without seeing themselves as addicts. That was a word for people who haunted opium dens, not respectable families taking medicine. Younger people, especially those with education, were more willing to accept that maybe grandma's remedies weren't as safe as everyone thought. Some of the most powerful voices for change came from unexpected places. Former users who had managed to break their dependence on patent medicines began sharing their stories. These weren't the stereotypical drug fiends that people imagined, but ordinary housewives, shopkeepers and clerks who described years of gradual enslavement to their daily doses of laudanum or morphine. The pharmaceutical industry fought back hard, of course. They hired their own doctors to write articles defending traditional medicines. They sponsored studies claiming that opium was safe when used properly. They even organized petition campaigns getting customers to sign statements opposing government interference in medical choices. And the weird part is, some of their arguments weren't entirely wrong. The early reform movement did sometimes throw out effective treatments along with dangerous ones. The push for regulation occasionally ignored the real medical needs of people who had few alternatives for managing chronic pain or serious illness. By the 1880s, though, the tide had clearly turned. Public opinion was shifting away from blind faith in patent medicines toward a more cautious approach to drug use. The question was no longer whether change would come, but how fast and how far it would go. The real test would come when lawmakers tried to turn this new awareness into actual regulations that could save lives without destroying livelihoods. Victorian doctors thought they knew everything about medicine. They didn't. When it came to understanding how drugs actually worked in the human body, these supposedly brilliant medical minds were stumbling around in the dark like children playing with dynamite. The gap between their confidence and their actual knowledge was staggering. Dr. William Hammond, a respected physician of the 1870s, genuinely believed that opium could cure tuberculosis, insanity, and even broken bones. His reasoning? Well, patients seemed calmer after taking it. Problem solved, right? Wrong. He was just watching people get high and calling it medicine. Medical journals from the era read like fantasy novels today. The British Medical Journal published papers claiming cocaine could treat everything from hay fever to impotence. One particularly confident doctor wrote that laudanum was nature's perfect remedy because it worked on so many conditions. He failed to mention that opium doesn't actually cure anything, it just masks pain while the body either heals itself or dies trying. Then there were the sleepy deaths that baffled Victorian physicians completely. Babies and adults would simply fall asleep and never wake up after taking their usual dose of opium-laced medicine. Doctors scratched their heads and blamed weak constitution or bad air. The concept of respiratory depression, where opiates literally stop you from breathing, was decades away from being understood. Some medical experts got creative with their theories. Dr. Francis Anstey spent years convinced that opium addiction was caused by moral weakness rather than the drug's chemical properties. He prescribed even more opium to strengthen the patient's resolve. Makes sense, right? Fight fire with fire, apparently. The weirdest part was how Victorian science approached dosing. They had no concept of body weight, tolerance, or individual sensitivity to drugs. A tiny infant received the same basic formula as a grown man, just a few drops less. When children died from overdoses, doctors blamed the parents for improper administration, rather than questioning whether babies should be getting opium at all. Medical schools taught students that addiction was impossible if drugs were used medicinally. This brilliant logic meant that as long as a doctor prescribed it, opium couldn't be habit-forming. Thousands of patients became addicted to their medicine while their physicians remained completely confused about why people kept coming back for more. Let's not forget the competing theories about how drugs actually worked. Some doctors believed opium balanced the humors, a medical concept left over from medieval times. Others thought it strengthened the blood or calmed nervous excitement. Nobody understood that opiates bind to specific receptors in the brain. They were basically throwing darts in the dark and celebrating when they accidentally hit something. The scientific method, as we know it today, barely existed in Victorian medicine. Doctors made sweeping claims based on a handful of patients. Dr. Robert Christison became famous for declaring that cocaine was perfectly safe after trying it on himself exactly once. His evidence? He felt energetic and alert. Revolutionary research there. Victorian physicians also had fascinating ideas about why some people became addicted while others didn't. Popular theories included inherited moral deficiency, excessive sensitivity to pleasure, and weakness of character. The idea that addiction might be a predictable biological response to repeated drug use was apparently too radical to consider. But here's where it gets really strange. Some doctors were starting to notice patterns they couldn't explain. They saw that patients who took opium regularly needed bigger doses over time. They observed withdrawal symptoms when the drugs were stopped. They documented the physical deterioration of long-term users. Yet they still couldn't connect these dots into a coherent understanding of addiction. Research methods were laughably primitive by today's standards. Doctors would try a new treatment on patients, write down what happened, and publish their results as definitive medical fact. No control groups, no statistical analysis, no peer review worth mentioning. Dr. William Osler became a respected authority on opium addiction after treating exactly 12 patients over 2 years. Medical conferences of the era were exercises in confident ignorance. Distinguished physicians would stand up and declare that morphine was safer than opium because it was more refined. Others argued that smoking opium was healthier than drinking laudanum because the lungs could better process the beneficial elements. These weren't fringe quacks. These were the leading medical minds of their generation. The tragedy is that some Victorian doctors were genuinely trying to help their patients. They prescribed what they believed were helpful medicines based on the best knowledge available. Unfortunately, that knowledge was approximately as useful as a chocolate teapot. While Victorian physicians were confidently prescribing dangerous drugs based on medieval theories and wishful thinking, the real world was conducting its own brutal experiments. But their scientific blind spots were just part of a much bigger picture that connected Britain to the far corners of its empire. The British Empire stretched across the globe like a massive spider web, and every strand led back to London's medicine cabinets. Victorian Britain didn't just stumble upon its drug habits by accident. The empire's incredible reach meant that opium, cocaine, and other powerful substances flowed into the country like rivers feeding into the sea. India became Britain's personal opium factory. The East India Company controlled vast poppy fields across Bengal and Bihar, turning entire regions into drug production centers. These weren't small family farms growing a few plants behind the barn. We're talking about industrial-scale operations that employed thousands of workers to harvest, process, and ship opium across the world. The company made so much money from opium that it basically funded British expansion for decades. Then there's China, which provided another massive source of drugs flowing back to Britain. The famous Opium Wars weren't just about forcing China to buy British opium. They also guaranteed that Chinese suppliers would keep sending their own varieties back to British ports. Chinese merchants knew exactly what Victorian customers wanted, and they delivered it by the ton. But wait, there's more to this global drug network than just the big players. Colonial outposts in Burma supplied different types of opium that some users preferred for specific ailments. Ceylon sent cocaine-rich plants that British chemists turned into the lozenges and powders filling pharmacy shelves. Even tiny Caribbean colonies contributed coca leaves and other plant-based drugs that ended up in British patent medicines. The shipping routes made it all possible. British merchant vessels crisscrossed the oceans carrying legitimate cargo like tea and spices, but their holds also contained massive quantities of raw opium and processed drugs. Port cities like Liverpool and Bristol became major distribution hubs where colonial drugs entered Britain and spread throughout the country. What made this system so effective was the complete lack of international drug laws. Countries didn't cooperate to stop drug trafficking because there was no concept of drug trafficking yet. Britain could import as much opium as it wanted from India without any other nation raising concerns. Chinese suppliers faced no international pressure to limit their exports. The global drug trade operated in broad daylight with government approval. The East India Company's business model depended heavily on opium profits. Company officials in India received bonuses based on how much opium they could produce and export. This created enormous incentives to expand poppy cultivation and find new markets for the finished product. Britain's own citizens became one of those markets, almost by accident. Ships returning from Asia carried such large quantities of opium that British ports couldn't handle it all for re-export. Surplus supplies naturally found their way into domestic markets, where British chemists and pharmacists snapped them up for local use. What started as an export business gradually became a major source of domestic supply. The colonial administrators often used opium themselves, which helped normalize its use back home. British officials serving in India regularly consumed opium-based medicines and wrote letters home praising their effectiveness. These personal recommendations from trusted family members and friends carried more weight than any advertising campaign could achieve. Trade records from the period show staggering numbers. In some years during the mid-1800s, British ships imported enough raw opium to supply every household in England with several pounds of the stuff. Most of it got processed into laudanum, patent medicines and various household remedies that ended up in Victorian medicine cabinets across the country. The weird part is how this massive drug importing operation was treated as completely normal business. Newspapers published shipping reports that casually mentioned opium cargoes alongside listings for cotton, sugar, and other everyday commodities. No one questioned whether importing industrial quantities of powerful narcotics might create problems at home. Colonial suppliers also adapted their products specifically for British tastes and medical practices. Indian processors learned to refine opium to the exact consistency that British pharmacists preferred for making laudanum. Chinese suppliers developed new smoking blends that British users found more appealing than traditional preparations. The global reach of British trade meant that even remote villages in England could access drugs that originated thousands of miles away. Travelling merchants who bought supplies in major port cities carried these colonial drugs to the furthest corners of the British Isles. A farmer in rural Scotland could purchase opium that started its journey in a Bengal poppy field months earlier. This international supply chain also meant that drug shortages were extremely rare in Victorian Britain. If one source experienced problems, ships could simply redirect to alternative suppliers in different colonies. The empire's diversity guaranteed steady supplies of various drugs regardless of local disruptions or harvest failures. The empire's massive drug importing operation created the foundation for everything that followed in Victorian medicine cabinets. But the global supply chain was just the beginning. Back home, clever marketers and manufacturers were already figuring out how to package these colonial drugs for British households, and one woman's advice would shape how families used them. Mrs. Isabella Beeton changed everything for Victorian housewives. Her famous book of household management became the Bible of domestic life in 1861. Every respectable middle-class home had a copy sitting on the kitchen shelf. The book contained over 900 pages of advice on everything from cooking roasts to managing servants. But tucked between recipes for plum pudding and instructions for starching collars were detailed recommendations for using opium as medicine. Beeton didn't hold back when listing opium's supposed benefits. She recommended it for coughs, diarrhea, and sleepless nights. Her book included precise measurements for mixing opium with other ingredients to create household remedies. A few drops of laudanum mixed with gin could supposedly cure a stomachache. Opium powder combined with flour made an excellent poultice for wounds according to her instructions. What made Beeton different from other advice givers was her warnings. She actually told mothers to be careful with dosages when treating children. Great caution must be observed in giving opium to young children, she wrote in clear, firm language. This was revolutionary thinking for the 1860s. Most patent medicine advertisements promised their products were completely safe for babies and toddlers. Then there's the fascinating contradiction in her approach. Beeton would recommend opium-based treatments on one page, then warn about their dangers on the next. She understood that these powerful substances could help or harm depending on how they were used. Her book contained detailed charts showing proper dosages for different ages and body weights. Makes sense, right? The weird part is how Victorian mothers responded to her advice. Some followed her warnings religiously, measuring out tiny drops with scientific precision. Others completely ignored the cautionary parts and focused only on the remedy recipes. They trusted their instincts over her careful instructions, often with terrible results. Beeton's influence reached far beyond London's wealthy neighbourhoods. Copies of her book travelled to remote villages and colonial outposts across the British Empire. Rural housewives who had never seen a trained doctor relied on her medical advice as gospel truth. Her recommendations shaped drug use patterns in households from Scotland to Australia. But here's where things get interesting. Beaton herself had personal experience with the medicines she recommended. She suffered from poor health throughout her life and used many of the opium-based treatments she described in her book. This wasn't theoretical advice from someone who had never touched the stuff. She knew firsthand how these remedies felt and worked. Let's not forget the timing of her warnings. Beaton published her book just as public opinion about drugs was starting to shift. Some doctors were beginning to speak out about the dangers of giving opium to children. Her cautious approach reflected this growing concern while still acknowledging the medical benefits these substances provided when used properly. Her specific advice about children reveals the complexity of Victorian drug use. Beaton recommended extremely small doses of laudanum for teething babies, but she also warned that too much could cause permanent harm. She suggested watching for signs of overdose like unusual sleepiness or difficulty breathing. This level of detail was rare in household advice books of the era. Well, not everyone appreciated her balanced approach. Some critics argued that she was being overly cautious and frightening mothers unnecessarily. Others claimed she wasn't cautious enough and should have recommended avoiding opium completely. She found herself caught between traditional medicine practices and emerging safety concerns. The most fascinating aspect of Beaton's drug advice was her emphasis on education. She didn't just tell housewives what to do. She explained why certain remedies worked and how they could go wrong. Her book included basic information about how opium affected the human body, something most Victorian women had never learned before. And the weird part is how her warnings actually increased drug use in some households. By providing detailed information about dosages and effects, she gave nervous mothers more confidence to try these remedies themselves. Knowledge that was meant to promote safety sometimes led to more experimentation instead. Her influence extended well beyond her lifetime. Beaton died young in 1865, but her book continued to be reprinted and updated for decades. Later editions gradually removed or modified the opium recommendations as public attitudes changed, but her original warnings remained influential in shaping more cautious approaches to household medicine. Beaton's legacy represents a turning point in how Victorian society thought about drugs and medicine. She bridged the gap between the old world of unrestricted drug use and the emerging era of medical caution. Her careful balance of practical advice and safety warnings helped prepare British households for the stricter regulations that were coming. But even Mrs. Beaton's sensible warnings couldn't stop the massive changes already brewing in British society. Public attitudes toward drugs were shifting faster than most people realized, and the comfortable world of household opium use was about to face its biggest challenge yet. By the 1890s, something extraordinary was happening across Britain. The same nation that had cheerfully dosed babies with opium and treated cocaine like candy was waking up from its drug-fueled dream. Well, more like a nightmare if you were keeping track of the death toll. The shift didn't happen overnight. Victorian families had spent decades trusting their medicine cabinets more than their doctors, but whispers of concern were growing louder. Mothers started questioning whether little Tommy's sleepy sickness might be connected to that daily dose of Godfrey's cordial. Factory workers began noticing that their opium-laced energy tonics left them feeling worse, not better. Medical journals were filling up with disturbing reports. Doctors who had once praised laudanum as a miracle cure were now writing cautionary articles with titles like The Hidden Dangers of Domestic Medicine. The evidence was piling up faster than empty opium bottles in a Victorian trash heap. Children weren't just getting sleepy from their soothing syrups, they were developing serious health problems that lasted for years. Then there were the death certificates. Coroners were starting to notice patterns that made them uncomfortable. Too many infants dying of mysterious ailments that looked suspiciously like drug overdoses. Too many working-class adults found dead with opium bottles nearby. The numbers were becoming impossible to ignore, even for a society that preferred to sweep unpleasant truths under ornate Persian rugs. Professional chemists played a surprising role in this awakening. Many had grown tired of selling dangerous concoctions to desperate customers. Some began refusing to stock the most potent patent medicines. Others started questioning manufacturers about their secret ingredients. A few brave souls even testified before parliamentary committees about the horrors they witnessed daily behind their shop counters. The upper classes were adapting faster than their working-class neighbors. Wealthy families had access to better educated doctors who understood the risks of narcotic dependency. They could afford safer alternatives when they became available. But most importantly, they weren't relying on drugs to survive brutal working conditions or inadequate housing that made everyone sick. Newspapers began running stories that would have been unthinkable just 20 years earlier. Headlines screamed about the opium baby crisis and cocaine's hidden dangers. Journalists investigated patent medicine companies, exposing their outrageous health claims and dangerous ingredients. Public opinion was shifting from trust to suspicion. Religious leaders joined the growing chorus of concern. Sunday sermons started addressing the moral dangers of drug dependency, not just for adults but for innocent children. Church groups organized educational meetings where reformed addicts shared their stories. The temperance movement, already focused on alcohol, expanded their mission to include other dangerous substances. Educational campaigns sprouted across the country like mushrooms after rain. Pamphlets with stark warnings about drug dangers appeared in schools, libraries, and community centers. Medical societies organized public lectures explaining addiction in terms ordinary people could understand. The message was simple: drugs that seemed helpful could destroy lives, but changing deeply rooted habits proved incredibly difficult. Generations of families had relied on opium-based remedies for everything from headaches to heartbreak. Grandmothers passed down recipes for calming cordials to their daughters who prepared them for their own children. Breaking these traditions required more than just information. It demanded entirely new ways of thinking about health and healing. Alternative treatments were slowly emerging to fill the gap. Doctors began prescribing gentler remedies that didn't carry the same risks of addiction or death. Aspirin, though not yet widely available, was being developed in laboratories. Herbal teas and simple remedies gained new respect as safer options for common ailments. The pharmaceutical industry itself was beginning to evolve. Reputable companies started distancing themselves from the most dangerous products. Some began including warning labels, though these were often buried in tiny print. A few forward-thinking manufacturers even started researching safer formulations that could provide relief without creating lifelong dependencies. Social pressure became a powerful force for change. Families who continued using traditional narcotic remedies found themselves facing criticism from neighbors and friends. Middle-class mothers who once proudly shared their favorite soothing syrup recipes now worried about being judged as irresponsible parents. The transformation wasn't uniform across Britain. Rural areas clung to old practices longer than cities. Working-class communities facing daily struggles that seemed to require chemical assistance were slower to abandon familiar remedies. But even in these resistant pockets, change was creeping in through conversations, newspaper articles, and tragic local examples of drug-related deaths. By decade's end, Victorian drug culture was clearly dying, though it would take years for the patient to be fully buried. The casual, widespread use of powerful narcotics was becoming socially unacceptable. Parents were seeking safer alternatives for their children's ailments. Workers were finding other ways to cope with difficult conditions. However, this cultural awakening created its own set of problems, as dedicated reformers would soon discover when they tried to completely eliminate Britain's drug habits through organized campaigns and legal pressure. The Victorian drug crisis couldn't continue forever. By the 1880s, enough children had died from opium poisoning that something had to give. Enter the reformers, a mix of angry mothers, horrified doctors, and religious leaders who decided Britain's drug-soaked culture needed serious fixing. These weren't your typical do-gooders waving pamphlets on street corners. Well, actually, some of them were exactly that, but they were armed with real evidence and growing public support. The Manchester Ladies' Temperance Union started tracking infant deaths linked to soothing syrups. Their records showed shocking numbers, entire neighborhoods losing babies to mysterious sleeping deaths that coincided perfectly with Godfrey's cordial sales. Dr. William Farr, Britain's chief medical statistician, became an unlikely hero in this fight. His dry government reports suddenly turned into weapons against the drug trade. Farr documented how regions with highest opium sales matched areas with highest child mortality rates. The correlation was impossible to ignore, even for Victorian officials who preferred looking the other way. Religious groups joined the crusade with typical Victorian enthusiasm. Methodist churches distributed leaflets titled "The Devil's Medicine Cabinet" outside pharmacies. These weren't subtle warnings either. They featured graphic illustrations of poisoned babies and families destroyed by addiction. Sunday sermons started focusing less on hellfire and more on the literal poisons people were buying at corner shops. The reformers faced one major problem though. Most families genuinely believed these medicines worked. Generations of mothers had quieted crying babies with opium drops. Factory workers swore by their morning laudanum for aches and pains. Convincing people to abandon proven remedies required more than scary stories. Smart reformers changed tactics. Instead of demanding people stop using drugs entirely, they promoted safer alternatives. chamomile tea for babies instead of opium cordials, willow bark for headaches rather than laudanum. These natural remedies weren't as effective, but they also weren't killing children by the hundreds. Education campaigns targeted schools directly. Teachers received special training on recognizing signs of drug poisoning in students. Children learned to spot dangerous medicine bottles at home. Some schools even staged dramatic presentations showing families destroyed by patent medicine addiction. Victorian kids apparently loved these morbid performances. The reformers' biggest breakthrough came from an unexpected source: former drug users themselves. Thomas de Quincey's Confessions of an English Opium Eater had romanticized addiction decades earlier. Now reformed addicts wrote their own confessions, but these focused on the misery rather than the poetry of drug dependence. Sarah Thompson, a working-class mother from Leeds, became famous for her testimony to Parliament about losing 3 children to soothing syrup overdoses. Her simple, heartbreaking account carried more weight than dozens of medical reports. Politicians couldn't dismiss her as an hysterical reformer. She was just a mother who trusted the wrong medicine. Medical professionals slowly joined the movement, but their motivations weren't always pure. Some genuinely worried about patient safety. Others saw an opportunity to increase their professional status by controlling what had been an unregulated market. Doctors realized they could charge higher fees if families needed prescriptions instead of buying cheap remedies at corner shops. The pharmaceutical industry fought back hard. Companies like Holloway's Pills and Cockle's Pills spent fortunes on newspaper advertisements, claiming their products were perfectly safe. They hired their own doctors to write testimonials. Some even sued reformers for damaging their reputations with false safety claims. But the tide was turning. Newspapers that had profited from patent medicine advertisements began refusing the most outrageous claims. The Times started requiring proof before printing health claims. Other papers followed suit, though mainly because they feared being associated with child deaths rather than from moral concerns. Parents began forming their own support networks. Mothers who'd lost children to drug poisoning visited other families to share their experiences. These informal warnings spread faster than official campaigns. Nothing convinced a Victorian mother like hearing from another mother who'd made the same tragic mistake. The reformers also targeted the economic angle that Victorian society understood best. They calculated the cost of lost productivity from workers too drugged to function properly. Factory owners started paying attention when presented with evidence that sober workers produced more goods and suffered fewer accidents. By the 1890s, reform pressure was creating real change. Pharmacists began posting warnings about dangerous ingredients. Some shops stopped selling the most lethal preparations entirely. Government inspectors started checking medicine quality more frequently, though enforcement remained spotty. The reformers had planted seeds that would soon bloom into comprehensive drug regulation. Their campaigns created public awareness that made stricter laws politically possible, but the drug sellers weren't giving up without a fight, and their response would create entirely new problems that Victorian society wasn't prepared to handle. The new laws created an interesting problem. Making drug sales harder didn't make people want them less. Actually, it worked the opposite way sometimes. When Victorian families couldn't walk into their local chemist and buy opium as easily as before, they found other ways to get what they wanted. Underground sellers popped up everywhere. These weren't shady criminals in dark alleys, though some of those existed too. Many were former chemists who lost their licenses, traveling salesmen who ignored the new rules, or even regular shopkeepers who kept their old stock hidden under the counter. They knew their customers still needed pain relief, sleep aids, and those trusted family remedies that had worked for generations. The black market for Victorian drugs looked nothing like what we might expect today. Picture Mrs. Henderson from down the street, whispering to her neighbor about where to find the good cough syrup for her teething baby. Or farmers meeting quietly at market day, sharing information about which traveling merchant still carried the opium-laced cattle medicine that actually worked. This wasn't criminal behavior in most people's minds. It was just getting around annoying new rules that interfered with practical medicine. Then there's the problem with enforcement. The 1868 Poisons Act sounded tough on paper, but Britain didn't have nearly enough inspectors to check every shop, market stall, and traveling cart in the country. Rural areas especially stayed almost completely unregulated for years. A single inspector might be responsible for dozens of towns and villages spread across miles of countryside. By the time they visited one location, checked the records, and moved on, illegal sellers could operate freely for months. Some sellers got creative with their workarounds. They'd rename their products to avoid the new regulations. Opium tincture became Oriental Sleep Remedy, or Eastern Comfort Drops. The ingredients stayed exactly the same, but the fancy new names helped sellers claim they weren't technically selling restricted substances. Customers caught on quickly to these code words. Well, the underground market created new dangers that legal sales never had. Licensed chemists, whatever their faults, usually knew what they were selling, and roughly how strong it was. Black market sellers often had no idea about dosages or purity. Some mixed their own concoctions using whatever opium or laudanum they could find, creating remedies that varied wildly in strength from batch to batch. Families found themselves taking bigger risks than ever before. A bottle of baby-quieting syrup from an underground cellar might be twice as strong as the old legal version, or it might be watered down and useless. Parents had no way to tell the difference until they tried it on their children. The results were sometimes tragic. But why did people keep seeking these dangerous alternatives? The answer was simple desperation mixed with habit. Victorian families had been using opium-based remedies for everything, from headaches to childbirth for decades. When teething babies screamed all night, when factory workers came home with aching backs, when women suffered through difficult pregnancies, they wanted the medicines that had always provided relief. New safer alternatives either didn't work as well or cost much more money. The weird part is how normal this illegal trade became in many communities. Entire neighborhoods knew exactly which baker sold laudanum along with bread, or which pub landlord kept cocaine lozenges behind the bar. Local constables often looked the other way, especially when their own families probably used the same underground remedies. Let's not forget that some areas never really accepted the new laws at all. Mining communities, textile towns and poor urban districts saw drug regulation as another way for wealthy politicians to interfere with working-class life. They had bigger problems than worrying about whether their pain medicine came from a licensed shop or not. If Godfrey's Cordial kept their babies quiet so parents could get some sleep before another 12-hour workday, the legal status seemed less important than survival. Underground sellers also served customers who had developed serious dependencies on opiates. These people couldn't simply stop using laudanum or opium when the laws changed. They needed their daily doses to function, and they'd pay almost any price or take almost any risk to get them. This created a steady customer base that kept black market dealers in business for years. The enforcement officers who tried to crack down on illegal drug sales faced an impossible task. Raids on suspected sellers often found nothing, because word traveled fast in tight-knit communities. Evidence disappeared quickly, records were destroyed, and witnesses claimed they never saw anything suspicious. Local magistrates sometimes sympathized more with the sellers than with the law enforcement officers trying to prosecute them. As regulation tightened further and police efforts increased, the underground drug trade would adapt and evolve. The sellers who survived learned to be more careful, more secretive, and unfortunately for their customers, more willing to cut corners on safety and quality to avoid detection. The Victorian era's wild drug experiment didn't just disappear overnight when the calendar flipped to 1901. Its fingerprints stayed all over British society for decades. Those opium-laced baby bottles and cocaine throat lozenges left marks that shaped how Britain dealt with drugs well into the 20th century. By the early 1900s, people started connecting the dots between Victorian drug habits and the social chaos they'd witnessed. Remember those neighborhoods where entire families seemed perpetually drowsy, where children grew up stunted and sickly? The new generation of doctors and social reformers pointed straight back to those medicine cabinets stuffed with laudanum and morphine. Opium dens became the poster child for everything wrong with unregulated drug use. These weren't just places where a few artistic types went to get inspired anymore. They'd become symbols of addiction, family breakdown, and social decay. Politicians loved using them as examples when arguing for stricter drug laws. Look what happens, they'd say, when we let people buy narcotics like grocery shopping. The pharmaceutical industry got a complete makeover too. Companies that had made fortunes selling Godfrey's Cordial and Dover's powder suddenly found themselves explaining why their miracle cures had been killing babies. Many simply rebranded, dropped the dangerous ingredients, and pretended their opium-pushing days never happened. Others went bankrupt when parents stopped buying their products. Then there's the legal system transformation. Victorian Britain's anything-goes approach to drug sales became a cautionary tale for lawmakers worldwide. The 1868 Poisons Act, which seemed revolutionary at the time, looked pathetically weak by 1920 standards. New laws kept piling up, each one trying to plug another hole that Victorian drug culture had torn in society's fabric. Medical schools started teaching entirely different approaches to pain management and childhood illnesses. Professors would show students Victorian-era medicine bottles and use them as examples of what not to do. Here's what doctors prescribed 50 years ago for teething, they'd say, holding up a bottle of opium syrup. Half these babies never made it to their first birthday. The working-class neighborhoods that had been hardest hit by Victorian drug culture became case studies for social workers. These areas showed higher rates of learning disabilities, shorter life expectancies, and ongoing addiction problems that seemed to pass from parent to child. Reformers realized they weren't just dealing with individual bad choices, they were cleaning up the mess from decades of normalized drug use. Interestingly, the upper classes who'd romanticized opium use in Victorian times suddenly developed collective amnesia about their drug habits. Literary circles that once celebrated laudanum-inspired creativity now focused on clear-minded artistic expression. Writers who'd built careers on opium-fueled visions either got sober or got forgotten. International relations shifted too. Britain's role in the global opium trade, which had seemed like smart business during Victorian times, became a diplomatic embarrassment. Other countries started pointing fingers at Britain for flooding the world with addictive substances. The same empire that had fought wars to keep opium markets open now had to explain why it was trying to close them. Women's rights activists seized on Victorian drug culture as evidence of male-dominated medicine's failures. They argued that doctors had turned generations of mothers into unwitting drug dealers, pushing opium on their own children because medical experts said it was safe. This became ammunition for campaigns demanding female doctors and women's voices in medical decisions. The most lasting impact might be how Victorian drug culture shaped Britain's approach to regulation itself. The country learned that leaving dangerous substances completely uncontrolled created disasters, but also that prohibition drove markets underground where they became even more dangerous. This push and pull between freedom and safety became the template for British drug policy for the next century. By the 1930s, Britain had built one of the world's most comprehensive drug control systems. Prescription requirements, medical licensing, age restrictions, dosage limits, warning labels, all of these grew directly from Victorian-era disasters. Each regulation traced back to some specific tragedy from the previous century's drug free-for-all. The pharmaceutical companies that survived the transition became much more careful about making health claims. The wild promises of Victorian advertisements, cures everything from coughs to melancholy, gave way to detailed scientific studies and conservative marketing. Nobody wanted to be the next company explaining dead children to angry parents. Even Britain's international reputation got rebuilt around drug responsibility. The country that had once pushed opium on China became a leader in international drug control treaties. Victorian mistakes became diplomatic credentials for the modern era. But here's where the story gets really interesting. Because while Britain was learning these hard lessons about drug regulation, the rest of the world was just discovering what Victorian families had been doing with their medicine cabinets. The bottle of cough syrup in your medicine cabinet today comes with enough warnings to fill a small novel: child-proof caps, dosage charts, ingredient lists, and warnings about drowsiness or interactions with other medications. Your Victorian ancestors would laugh at all this fuss. They'd probably wonder why we make such a big deal about keeping medicine away from children when they used to dose babies with opium for teething troubles. But here's where things get interesting. Most of those Victorian wonder drugs that families relied on daily are now banned substances that could land you in prison. That innocent-looking bottle of laudanum sitting on grandmother's kitchen shelf. Today it's classified alongside heroin and cocaine as a controlled substance. The same opium tincture that Victorian mothers gave freely to crying infants now requires prescriptions, monitoring, and strict dosage controls. Modern pharmaceutical companies spend years testing new drugs before they reach the market. Clinical trials, safety studies, and regulatory approval processes can take decades. Victorian drug makers, they mixed up batches in back rooms and started selling immediately. No testing required. If customers complained about side effects, well, that was considered normal. The idea that medicines might need to be proven safe before sale was revolutionary thinking. Today's prescription system would seem impossibly complicated to Victorian families. Need pain relief? You can't just walk into a pharmacy and buy laudanum anymore. You need a doctor's visit, a written prescription, and pharmacies track every pill dispensed. The whole process that Victorian chemists completed in 30 seconds now involves multiple professionals, computer systems, and government oversight. Then there's the matter of childhood medicine safety. Modern parents obsess over giving children the correct dosage of simple fever reducers. We use measuring spoons, read labels multiple times, and call doctors if we're unsure about anything. Victorian parents routinely gave their children substances that would horrify today's medical professionals. The same opium doses that seemed normal in 1850 would trigger Child Protective Services investigations today. Drug education has transformed completely. Victorian families learned about medicine through word of mouth, newspaper advertisements, and trial and error. Today's parents have access to detailed information about every ingredient, potential side effects, and drug interactions. We can research medicines online, read medical studies, and consult multiple healthcare providers. Victorian families trusted whatever the traveling medicine salesman told them. But the weird part is how some attitudes haven't changed that much. Victorian families wanted quick fixes for common ailments, just like modern consumers do. They bought patent medicines promising miraculous cures, similar to how people today chase the latest health trends and miracle supplements. The human desire for easy solutions to health problems remains remarkably consistent across centuries. Modern addiction treatment represents perhaps the biggest change from Victorian times. Today, drug addiction is recognized as a medical condition requiring professional treatment, therapy, and ongoing support. Victorian society viewed addiction as a moral failing or personal weakness. People suffering from opium dependency in the 1800s had virtually no treatment options beyond attempting to quit on their own. Legal consequences tell another dramatic story. Possessing the same amount of cocaine that a Victorian gentleman might casually purchase for toothache relief could result in serious criminal charges today. The legal landscape has completely flipped. What was once normal consumer behavior is now prosecuted as drug trafficking. Quality control represents another massive shift. Modern medicines undergo rigorous testing for purity, consistency, and safety. Every batch is monitored, ingredients are precisely measured, and contamination is virtually eliminated. Victorian medicines varied wildly in potency and purity. The same brand of laudanum might be twice as strong in one bottle compared to another, leading to accidental overdoses. Professional medical training has evolved dramatically too. Today's doctors spend years studying pharmacology, drug interactions, and addiction medicine. Victorian physicians often prescribed opium and cocaine with minimal understanding of their long-term effects or addictive properties. Modern medical schools dedicate entire courses to subjects Victorian doctors never considered. Child protection laws now specifically address medicine safety. Child-proof containers, poison control centers, and strict labeling requirements all stem from hard-learned lessons about pharmaceutical dangers. Victorian families learned these lessons the tragic way, through preventable deaths and lifetime addictions. However, some parallels exist between Victorian patent medicine marketing and modern pharmaceutical advertising. Both eras feature bold claims about miraculous results, though modern advertising faces much stricter regulation. Victorian medicine ads promised to cure everything from melancholy to consumption. Today's drug advertisements still promise dramatic life improvements, just with more legal disclaimers. The global nature of drug regulation has also transformed since Victorian times. International treaties now control narcotic substances worldwide, something unimaginable when British merchants freely imported opium from India and China. Modern drug policy requires international cooperation and shared standards. What makes this historical comparison especially fascinating is how it reveals both progress and persistent challenges in human nature's relationship with chemical solutions to life's problems. But there's one more layer to this story that brings everything full circle. Looking back at Victorian Britain's wild drug experiment feels like peering into an alternate reality. Families casually dosing babies with opium, cocaine sold as throat lozenges, housewives brewing narcotic cocktails in their kitchens. The whole thing reads like fiction, but every bit was real life for millions of people. What strikes you most about this era? Maybe it's the sheer audacity of giving morphine to teething infants, or perhaps the way educated doctors genuinely believed heroin was safer than aspirin. The Victorians weren't reckless monsters. They were doing what seemed logical with the knowledge they had. That's the scary part. Their drug culture wasn't born from rebellion or escapism like modern addiction stories. It grew from practical needs and limited medical options. When your child screamed all night from colic, Godfrey's cordial seemed like a miracle. When factory work destroyed your back, laudanum felt like salvation. Makes sense, right? But here's where Victorian innovation collided with devastating consequences. Their willingness to experiment created both medical breakthroughs and generational trauma. The same period that gave us anesthesia and pain management also killed thousands of children through accidental overdoses. Progress always comes with a price. though few eras paid it so brutally. Well, the transformation didn't happen overnight. Change crept through British society like morning fog, slow, inevitable, and impossible to ignore once it arrived. The 1868 Poisons Act marked the beginning, but cultural shifts took decades longer. Parents gradually stopped trusting patent medicines. Doctors began questioning old assumptions. Newspapers started reporting drug deaths instead of miracle cures. And the weird part is how completely Victorian drug culture vanished. Within a generation, practices that seemed perfectly normal became scandalous. Imagine today's parents discovering their grandmothers regularly dosed children with heroin. That's essentially what happened as the 20th century dawned. The stories of famous addicts like literary figures helped change public perception too. When respected writers published accounts of opium dependency, it humanized addiction beyond working-class stereotypes. Suddenly, drug problems weren't just about moral failing or social class. They could affect anyone. Then there's the international angle that often gets overlooked. Britain's global empire created the very drug supply chains that flooded their domestic market. Colonial opium from India, cocaine from South America, and exotic remedies from across the world all ended up in British medicine cabinets. The empire that profited from global drug trade eventually became its own victim. Victorian reformers deserve credit for gradually awakening public consciousness. They faced enormous resistance from established interests, pharmaceutical companies, traditional doctors, and families who swore by old remedies. Changing deeply rooted cultural practices required patience and persistence. The fact that they succeeded at all seems remarkable. Let's not forget the women who quietly led much of this transformation. Mothers who lost children to overdoses, wives who watched husbands destroy themselves with laudanum, female reformers who distributed educational pamphlets despite social expectations. Victorian drug culture might have been male-dominated, but women drove many of the changes that ended it. The economic factors played a huge role too. As cheaper, safer alternatives became available, expensive narcotic treatments lost their appeal. Why spend money on opium when aspirin worked better for headaches? Market forces often accomplish what moral campaigns cannot. Modern Britain inherited both the benefits and scars from this Victorian experiment. Today's strict prescription laws, drug education programs, and addiction treatment systems all emerged from lessons learned during that chaotic century. Every warning label on medication bottles echoes Victorian tragedies. But here's what really matters for us today. The Victorian experience proves how quickly normal can become unthinkable. Social practices that seem permanent often aren't. Cultural blind spots that affect entire populations can be overcome through education and advocacy. Their story also reveals how innovation without regulation creates predictable disasters. Every new drug that hit Victorian markets followed the same pattern: initial enthusiasm, widespread adoption, gradual recognition of dangers, and eventual restrictions. We see similar cycles today with everything from social media to artificial intelligence. The Victorians thought they were solving humanity's oldest problems: pain, sleeplessness, crying babies, workplace exhaustion. Instead, they created new problems that took generations to understand and address. Good intentions paired with incomplete knowledge often produce unintended consequences. Their legacy reminds us that progress isn't always linear or logical. Sometimes societies have to experiment, fail, and learn from mistakes before finding better solutions. The Victorian drug era was messy, dangerous, and ultimately necessary for developing modern medical ethics and safety standards. Maybe that's the real lesson here. Every generation inherits both the wisdom and mistakes of those who came before. The Victorians gave us anesthesia, pain management, and pharmaceutical innovation. They also showed us what happens when miracle cures meet inadequate regulation. Understanding their struggles helps us make smarter choices about the challenges we face today. History doesn't repeat, but it sure does rhyme. And sometimes learning from the past really is the best medicine for getting a good night's sleep.